Tyranny of Steel, chapters 160 to 177. Chapter 160 Proclamation of the Reformation. In the corner of the great hall of Berengar's castle, Ludolf stayed standing. He had sat through and watched the entirety of the Council of Kufstein take place. As an important figurehead of the Reformation, he had been privy to the meeting between the various noblemen and clergy members who supported his and Berengar's endeavors. Though he seldom spoke, his words had carried great weight. Having witnessed the conversation between the cardinal and Berengar, Ludolf took the opportunity to approach his old friend, who had helped him on his path to enlightenment. When Berengar was sitting alone on his seat of power, Ludolf approached and began to express his thoughts on the principles of what would soon become known as the German Reformation. "Your Excellency, you should know that the Church's response will be one of sheer brutality. With the Cardinal turning his back on the Catholic Church and endorsing our ideas, there will be no shortage of chaos that follows." Berengar gazed at the priest who had been instrumental in spreading the message of the Reformation with a solemn expression on his face. Great change in society will always lead to conflict between those who are too stubborn to advance with the new age. From the moment we began to challenge papal authority, it was inevitable that blood would be spilled. However, this brings opportunity. The more the Catholics seek to oppress us, the easier it will be to drive them from the German lands. Ludolf sighed heavily at the thought. He knew at the moment Catholics and Reformists could not peacefully coexist. He also knew that Berengar planned to take advantage of the ensuing violence to establish himself as a major power within the European realms. However, Ludolf was a pious man and did not care which secular leader sat upon the throne of Germany so long as the ruler was friendly towards the Reformation. The young priest admitted he was quite lucky. Berengar and his armies afforded him protection, and as such, the Church had no real ability to punish him for his alleged heretical beliefs without a full-scale invasion of Tyrol, which at the moment would prove difficult for them, due to the numerous conflicts the existing holy orders continued to wage. Ultimately, Ludolf found himself in agreement with Berengar's words. However, he still expressed his concern. Germany is already in a state of turmoil. This schism in the Church will undoubtedly cause more conflict. The duchies will fracture as lords turn on one another over accusations of heresy and corruption. Do you not lament the loss of life that will occur? Berengar nodded his head at Ludolf's words and offered his own views on the matter. Did you forget what happened to Suhl? If we do not gain significant support for our cause, countless people will be murdered by the Church in an attempt to suppress our views. Only by uniting together and forming a bloc of like-minded noblemen and clergy can we withstand the might of the Catholic Church and spread our views. Yes, lives will be lost in this conflict, but think about how many voices will be snuffed out if we sit back and do nothing. After hearing these words, and being reminded of what the Teutonic Order had done to the town of Suhl, even a pious man like Ludolf struggled to contain his rage. Such an outrageous action was all too common for crusaders, especially in the Middle East. Yet to do it to your fellow Christians over a simple difference of opinion, Ludolf found that unforgivable. As such, he clenched his fists and found his resolve to weather the tide that would soon be arriving. After several moments of contemplation, he responded to Berengar's words. "I understand. I will do what I must to spread the word of our Reformation." Seeing Ludolf had agreed, Berengar smiled and rose from his seat before walking over to Ludolf and clasped him on the shoulders in a friendly gesture. "It is up to us to liberate the German people from the shackles of the Church." Ludolf nodded at Berengar's words and smiled before responding. Indeed, with that, the two men had begun the Protestant Reformation 100 years in advance of which would naturally occur within this timeline without Berengar's intervention. The next day the public announcement of the German Reformist Church was declared, with Tyrol being its seat of influence. However, the regions occupied by Reformist lords and clergy did not stop there. It spread into portions of Kur, Vorarlberg, Salzburg, Kärnten, Upper Bavaria, and Swabia well. Southern Germany and eastern Switzerland had become a hot zone of reformist thought and teachings. Many of the local lords and middle nobility shared their interests and protected their people from the wrath of the Catholic Church and their followers. Of course, when news of this schism spread to the Vatican, Pope Simeon II nearly had an aneurysm from the sheer degree of rage he felt. He instantly began to curse at his cardinals upon hearing that a large swath of southern Germany and eastern Switzerland had basically declared open rebellion against his authority. He could no longer deny that the influence of Berengar and Ludolf had spread beyond his imagination. It was time to settle the dispute with the so-called papacy of Avignon, for if the Catholic Church were not united, they would not be able to quash this heresy, and the Church would be permanently in a state of schism. As such, Pope Simeon got down from his throne and approached one of his subordinates. The expression on his face was one of utter fury as he bellowed his orders at the man. "Contact that French bastard, and let him know that I'm calling for the Council of Constance to meet earlier than anticipated. This heresy is too important to wait any longer." However, the meeting spot of the Council of Constance would have to change from the bishopric of Constance to a new venue. After all, Germany was now a hotbed of religious and civil conflict. They would not be safe within its borders. As such, the final Council of Constance would be moved to neutral ground in Córdoba, Spain, in this timeline. The subordinate quickly bowed his head to the Pope and agreed immediately to his demands. "Of course, Your Holiness." With that, subordinate had rushed to fulfill his task, leaving Pope Simeon II fuming in anger at the thought of Berengar's influence over southern Germany, which had spread like wildfire since the Pope had first heard of the young man less than a year ago. He did not know how Berengar had managed to achieve such things, yet it was becoming clear that if Simeon was the representative of God on earth, Berengar was Satan's representative. Or at least in the eyes of the Catholic Church. Berengar the Accursed had caused too much damage to Catholic influence over southern Germany, and his views would only spread further now that they had received legitimacy in the eyes of high-ranking clergymen and nobility. Simeon scoffed at the idea and voiced his inner thoughts aloud for all nearby to hear. Church of the German Reformation? What nonsense is this? These heretics will pay for their sins one way or another. I swear by the Heavenly Father that I will personally see an end to this farce. Despite this solemn vow, Simeon would have a difficult time doing so, as the reconciliation between the papacy of the Vatican and the papacy of Avignon at the upcoming Council of Constance, or as it would be known in the future as the Council of Córdoba, would prove to be a challenge to his authority as Pope. After all, he intended to mend the schism between Avignon and the Vatican, and this would require some form of agreement to come into place about who was the one true Pope. The Council of Kufstein and the following proclamation of the German Reformation would forever alter the history in this timeline. Years of bloodshed and destruction would follow this development. However, in the end, these events would lead to further schisms in the Church. The Protestant Reformation had begun, and Pandora's box had been opened. Despite the Catholic Church's best efforts, they would never be able to hold onto the absurd amount of power they had sustained throughout these past centuries. Berengar had made sure of that. Ironically, the papacy had brought this upon themselves. If the Church had left Berengar alone, he never would have started this conflict so early in his lifetime. Initially, he had planned to live out a life of peace as a lowly baron and bring wealth and prosperity to his people. However, Lambert's actions and those of his allies in the Church had forced his hand. As Berengar accumulated more power, so too did his ambitions and enemies grow, and when the Church reached out its hand to swat him away like a mosquito, he bit down into it and inflicted a dangerous disease upon it. Thus, they had created a powerful enemy by trying to get rid of a seemingly insignificant baron's son in an isolated region within Tyrol. One who would forever liberate the German people from the shackles of the Catholic Church and the immense corruption that sustained it. Chapter 161 The Council of Córdoba. Enough time had passed since the proclamation of the German Reformation, to the point where the authorities of the Catholic Church, or at least those who were still loyal to it, had gathered in Córdoba at its famous cathedral. There they began to squabble about the ongoing events that were of pressing concern. Berengar's Reformation was far more popular than they had initially estimated, especially after the revelation of the Church's infinite corruption and crimes by Ludolf. As such, this was the most important concern in which they discussed at the gathering. Simeon, as always, had started the meeting by shouting at anyone who opposed him. Though he called this meeting ahead of schedule to address the German Reformation and the schism between the papacy in Avignon and the Vatican, he was not a diplomatic man. He was currently engaged in a debate with the Pope of Avignon, Avilius III, over what should be done about the matter. If we do not mend our differences, this heresy being called the German Reformation will sweep across Christendom like a plague. However, Avilius was in disagreement after all Berengar had labeled it the German Reformation. After the last meeting, the French Pope had gathered quite a bit of information on Berengar. As far as he could tell, Berengar's ambitions solely lay within the German-speaking regions. Thus he did not accept the notion that this reformation was designed for anything more than Germany. Thus he was certain to voice his opinion on the matter. Berengar and his pet priest Ludolf have labeled this the German Reformation. Why should I care what those savages to the east believe? The Holy Roman Empire is your puppet, not mine. Avilius, as always, was drinking from an entire flagon of wine while making his opinion well heard. Though he was not as abrasive as Simeon, he was equally short-sighted, not realizing that allowing the German Reformation to fester could allow newer branches of Christianity to pop up and further challenge papal authority. These two men were both proclaiming themselves to be the central figure of authority for all of Christendom, and as such, were constantly at one another's throats. Simeon, as always, was flushed with rage. His face was practically the color of a tomato as he shouted at Avilius once more. Not your problem. The souls of every German are at risk to this heresy. Do you not care about their salvation? Avilius merely smirked smugly in response to Simeon's accusations. He could not very well admit his utter contempt for the German people. After all, such a declaration would be unbefitting of a man who proclaimed himself Pope. However, he could not reject the claim in good conscience, as doing so would compromise his beliefs. This action, of course, further enraged Simeon, who struggled to contain his growing wrath. Seeing the direction in which the meeting was heading toward, one of the cardinals present immediately raised a major concern. After all, the voice of reason who normally convinced these two to behave themselves was no longer present, for he had switched sides and joined the German Reformation. Cardinal Engelbert is no longer with us, and as such, we should take time to consider the consequences of having a cardinal join this heresy known as the German Reformation. Seeing that the discussion was switched in another direction, the two popes decided to put aside their differences for the time being and address this concern. Avilius's reaction was quite extraordinary. We should capture all of the German cardinals and interrogate them to find out whether or not they have sympathies for this heresy. It is the only way to ensure that more of them do not flock to this so-called Reformation. Simeon, on the other hand, was once more outraged over Avilius's ideas. Though the Italian monarch led the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Germany had always been an important factor in the empire's stability. For many centuries, the German monarchs ruled the empire. With the ongoing civil and religious crisis in Germany, the power and authority of the Holy Roman Emperor had diminished. In Simeon's view, if they were to discriminate against the German cardinals who have shown no sign of heresy, then they would be driving more people into the German Reformation, thus weakening the authority of not only the Vatican but also the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, the only person who would benefit from such an outcome would be Avilius, the Pope of Avignon, whose influence greatly stretched to the Kingdom of France, which had a long-standing rivalry with Germany for many centuries. As such, Simeon quickly responded to this idea with contempt. You would like that, wouldn't you, Avilius? The only person who could benefit from the resulting chaos that would ensue would be you. Avilius, of course, was drinking from his flagon of wine when he denied the accusations against him. I am sure I have no idea what you are talking about, Simeon. The result of this brief exchange caused the entire council to result in chaos as the cardinals and bishops who gathered all began to scream at each other and hurl insults. Eventually, a loud whistling noise appeared across the room, instantly silencing all of the banter. When the cardinals and bishops searched for who was responsible for the noise, they noticed a cardinal scowling at all of them as if they were a bunch of bratty children. After staring down the crowd of clergymen for some time, the cardinal finally voiced his opinion on the matter. It has become increasingly clear to me that neither Avilius nor Simeon are fit to be pope. Thus, what I propose is simple. Both of you, two imbeciles, step down from your positions and allow us all to elect a single new pope, one who is actually capable of combating the crisis in which we find ourselves. Avilius and Simeon immediately protested this option. However, they found little support in the room. Absolutely not. Who are you calling an imbecile? Yet, not a single voice defended them among the crowd. The two men finally realized that their support had dwindled. Last year this council was split into two sides that supported either of the two potential popes. However, now, after the debacle that had occurred during this timeframe and their petty squabbling, not a single clergyman within the room was in support of either of these prospective popes. The cardinal who voiced this option stared menacingly at the two self-proclaimed popes and chastised them like children. Engelbert joined the reformist movement because he was sick and tired of dealing with you idiots and felt that the reformist movement provided a better alternative. If neither of you is willing to abdicate, then you leave us with no choice. We will elect a new pope and declare both of your positions invalid, which will only further increase the volatility of the situation we find ourselves in. For once in your lives, you two should do what is best for the church and not your own selfish ambitions." After such a verbal thrashing, both Simeon and Avilius looked at each other with helpless expressions. Ultimately, Avilius was the first to speak. "I voluntarily abdicate my position as head of the papacy of Avignon and hereby declare my support to the election of a new unified pope." With Avilius' abdication, all that remained was Simeon. As such, the entire Council of Córdoba stared at him with intimidating eyes before finally the man broke from the pressure and bent to their will. "I, too, abdicate my position." With that, the two former popes sat down in their seats and admitted defeat. They may be a pair of incompetent fools. Still, even they could realize when they lacked support. If they refused to abdicate, they would be forced by the ecclesiarchy out of their positions and wander the world as self-proclaimed popes with no real power or authority. It was best to remove themselves and still maintain some degree of authority within a unified Catholic Church. Thus, the College of Cardinals would hold an election in the upcoming month, where a single pope would be elected and placed in command of the Catholic Church for years to come. Whether or not this pope would be more competent than Simeon and Avilius were yet to be known, but it was a good start on the path to recovery. Though they solved one of the major issues of contention, two major issues presented themselves, which needed to be thoroughly discussed. The ongoing German Reformation and the Teutonic States' war with the Golden Horde. As such, the Council had only begun to solve the current crisis the Catholic Church was going through. While the Council of Córdoba was ongoing, Berengar and his allies in the German Reformation had made great plans to secure the regions in which their movement had taken a foothold. Tyrol, of course, was as secure as a region could become in this chaotic age, yet Berengar's neighbors would need some assistance, and the young count was more than happy to capitalize on such a venture. Chapter 162 Council of Córdoba II. Many of the cardinals and bishops had gathered within the Cathedral of Córdoba to discuss the many problems currently plaguing the Catholic Church. Though they had finally found a solution to mend the old Western schism that had been ongoing for close to half a century, there were still two major issues that presented themselves. Chief among them was the ongoing German Reformation, which had spread beyond their control to the southern regions of Germany. As such, the various cardinals and bishops were discussing how to move forward. With Simeon and Avilius removed from power, the conversation was far more cordial between the various factions of the Church. At the moment, the answer which everyone had agreed to was military force. However, the military orders of the Catholic Church were all busy fighting external enemies at the moment, and the last group of crusaders, which was tasked with eliminating Berengar and purging Tyrol of heretics, was slaughtered in battle by Berengar's forces. As for the Vatican, they were aware that Berengar was using advanced weapons within his army. One man, in particular, acted as a second-hand witness to this information. That was the Prince Bishop of Trent, whose lands were annexed by Berengar during his winter campaign to seize Tyrol. The Prince Bishop spoke with an intense hatred for Berengar about the issues at hand and how it would not be an easy task to root out the reformists who have mostly formed within the mountainous territory of the Alps. The weapons in which Berengar's infantry use have the capacity to kill a man at over 400 yards. They penetrate through plate armor with ease and leave an untreatable hole in the victims' bodies. These are no mere hand cannons but something else entirely. The average soldier is equipped with plate armor that covers their vital areas, and is virtually impenetrable by man's weapons. If we are to march on the Alps, we would need a massive force, one in which is armed with the hand cannon in vast numbers. The surrounding clergymen listened to this Prince Bishop's rant, and many of them did not believe their ears. After all, how could such a weapon possibly exist? Nevertheless, what came next shocked them further. He employs cannons, whose cannonballs explode upon impact, killing multiple men within the blast zone. These cannons are highly maneuverable and far more destructive than anything we have seen before. I know not how he obtained these advanced weapons, but we cannot win by sheer numbers. After all, the Teutonic Order tried these tactics, and they were trapped in the mountains where the heretics mercilessly slaughtered them. The more the Prince Bishop ranted and raved about the spectacular performance of Berengar's weapons and the armies who wielded them, the more clergymen within the meeting began to disregard his words as pure fiction. At a point, a relatively fat and loathsome cardinal raised his head and began to insult the prince-bishop. "I suppose you personally witnessed these weapons in use?" This question immediately made the Prince-Bishop of Trent frown. After all, he had not witnessed the battle that had taken place. Instead, he was hiding like a coward in his cathedral before fleeing the city while his soldiers sacrificed themselves. Ultimately, he had to admit to the fact that this was all second-hand information from his garrison commander. "I am afraid not, however. This information was reported to me by my garrison commander before he and his men distracted the heretics long enough for me to escape to the Vatican to deliver the news." Several of the attending members of the Council of Córdoba began to scoff at the Prince-Bishop of Trent's words. Clearly, the Prince-Bishop believed the wild tales of a frightened soldier, or so many of the council members believed. Ultimately, few decided to take the Prince-Bishop's warning seriously. After all, they severely lacked the manpower to invade southern Germany in the first place. That is, of course, until one of the cardinals proposed an opportunity. "Why don't we call for a crusade to wipe out the heretics in Germany? It has worked before. Even if they are as well armed as the Prince-Bishop claims, what can they possibly do against an army of 100,000 men who have taken up the cross? Surely we can sponsor such a vast army, by calling upon the lords and knights of Europe to defend Christendom from this vile blasphemy? Do we really need to wait for the existing holy orders to finish their wars when we can create new ones?" These were all excellent questions, which could easily be answered. After all, it had been quite some time since a pope had declared a crusade, and due to the success of the previous crusades in this world, the idea was quite popular and would undoubtedly draw in a lot of potential troops to invade southern Germany with. After a bit of discussion, this was how the Council of Córdoba chose to deal with Berengar and the reformist movement. Unfortunately for the future crusaders, by the time they could fully prepare such a massive force for the invasion, years would have passed, and Tyrol would be a self-sustaining stronghold. Berengar would be more than ready for such a force. However, how could these men possibly know the future? As such, after figuring out how to deal with the German Reformation, they moved on to the last topic at hand. One of the participating cardinals brought up the matter of the Teutonic state and the crisis they were currently facing. The Teutonic Order has angered the Golden Horde by waging war against the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which is their protectorate. They are currently facing a crisis the likes we have not seen in decades. If we aid them, we will only be furthering the rift forming with the Eastern Orthodox Church. How shall we proceed? Instantly the opinion of the participating clergymen was divided. Some supported the Teutonic Order, and others believed they should never have been attacking the Orthodox to begin with. As such, they quickly devolved into an argument about this issue. One of the bishops attending voiced his support for the Teutonic Order and their conquests of the East. "The Teutonic Order is the bulwark of Christendom in the East. They must not fall to these heathens. I say we supply them with the funding and equipment necessary to win the war at their doorsteps." However, a cardinal instantly voiced his objection to this matter. "Preposterous, we should never have been involved with the Teutonic Order's war in the first place. If Simeon had not supported them in their efforts, they never would have had the ability to take over the Muscovites. Now more than ever, we need to rely on our allies to the east. The German Reformation will be causing a lot of troubles in the future, and we will need the support of the Orthodox Church if we seek to end it swiftly." Without a pope in the audience, there was no way to move forward with the ideas presented unless all parties agreed. They could easily agree on a crusade to crush the German Reformation, but supporting the Teutonic Order during their crisis in which they brought upon themselves. That was a point of contention between the various factions of the Church. As such, the men continued to squabble amongst themselves over this one issue for a week before concluding that they would provide material aid to the Teutonic Order, but they would not provide any troops or economic support. The Teutonic Order was left on its own to fight the enemies in which it had created, at least for the most part. After all, the Church was more concerned with putting down the German Reformation, which posed a far greater threat than the Golden Horde. If this were the army of Genghis Khan from centuries prior, then maybe there would be a need for concern. However, at the moment, Berengar was a far greater threat for the Church, and they needed time and resources to prepare for a great crusade against him and his followers. Berengar, of course, anticipated this move by the Church, and he had no qualms building a sufficient force in the meantime to deal with the threat the Crusaders would pose shortly. However, for now, he was fairly relaxed as he focused his efforts on what he had been doing since his return from the campaign in Tyrol. Building his army and defenses while maintaining his trade with the various factions who wanted his arms and armor. As for the Reformation's place in this world, it was not so easily diminished. Word had spread that the German Reformation had begun, and plenty of people saw it as an opportunity to take back power from the Church, something in which most secular rulers had desired for some time. Even if they did not necessarily agree with the teachings of the German Reformation themselves, the idea of getting rid of the Church's influence over secular affairs was attractive enough to join in with the reformist movement as such. Berengar's allies grew in numbers, which would be useful in the upcoming war with the Catholic Church. Ultimately, the Council of Córdoba ended in what could be considered a monumental success for the Catholic Church. The Western Schism had been mended, and a plan was in place to deal with the German Reformation. As for the Teutonic state, they were left to their own devices for the most part. Thus, the Catholic Church had addressed the ongoing crises from which it was currently suffering. However, in the end, this would not be enough to stop the growing tide of the German Reformation and Berengar's rise to power. Chapter 163 Catfight. The light of the sun shone down upon Adela's room and through her glass window, illuminating her doll-like face as she slept beneath her covers. It was well past dawn, and yet the young girl still slept. After all, she was still growing and, as such, needed her beauty rest. After a short period of struggling to adjust to the light which beamed upon her, she began to pout before opening her deep sapphire eyes and gazing at her window with contempt. Now that she was awake, she decided to get out from under her covers, where she wore a frilly white nightgown. As per most of her clothing, Berengar designed it with both comfort and aesthetic in mind. The soft silk material dangled loosely from the growing curves of her adolescent body. After stretching for a little bit, she decided to go about her morning basic hygiene rituals such as bathing, brushing her teeth, and flossing before finally dressing in her exquisite attire based on Tudor and Elizabethan clothing patterns from Berengar's past life. After getting dressed in her daily attire, she progressed to the dining hall where her family was gathering to eat breakfast. Ever since her sister Ava had arrived in Graz, Adela had been doing her best to stay away from the woman. After all, despite being siblings, the two got along about as well as cats and dogs. For whatever reason, the Count of Salzburg's son and heir was spending his time in Graz with his wife and 3 children. Though Adela did not understand why this was the case, after all, Salzburg was safe enough, and the excuse of being on vacation visiting Ava's family had long since grown suspicious. Despite Adela's growing concerns over her eldest sister's stay, she still tried to play nice with the young woman, and as such, the two sat across from one another at the dining table, where the two began to mince words. Ava was, as always, the perpetrator of their little disputes, and as such, decided to bully her cute little sister. "Adela, I heard your fiancé was bold enough to declare his heresy as a reformation. I wonder what will happen to him when the Pope finally declares a crusade to deal with the trouble he has caused. I worry for your safety. After all, you are engaged to the man that the Church refers to as Berengar the Accursed." Immediately the women went straight for the heart, knowing that Adela's relationship with Berengar was her most vulnerable point. However, since their first dispute, Adela had grown wiser and noticed that her eldest sister so commonly targeted Berengar with her words in an attempt to rile her up. As such, Adela was as calm as a pond's surface as she rebutted Ava's taunt. Any force the Vatican sends into Tyrol will end up the same as the last group of fools who entered Berengar's domain in an attempt to remove him from power. She was quite obviously referring to the slaughter of the Teutonic Order's army, which marched into Berengar's lands. The result of that battle was well known among the lords and ladies of the German-speaking regions. However, Ava knew something that most did not know. After all, her husband was the son and heir to the Count of Salzburg, and his father's spy network was extensive. As such, she further taunted Adela with her attacks on Berengar's character. "Poor sweet little Lambert, I heard Berengar used some vile sorcery to kill that poor boy in battle. What kind of black-hearted man murders his own little brother?" Though Adela tried to stay calm, hearing her sister compliment Lambert while insulting Berengar's character was enough to invoke ire in her heart. Ava dared to act like Lambert was a saint, despite knowing of his past deeds. However, this was exactly how the Church was behaving about the issue. Ever since Lambert's death, he had become a martyr in the eyes of Catholics and a stain on Berengar's reputation. Every wicked deed the boy had ever committed was wiped away from his past by the powerful propaganda network of the Church. the Catholic Church depicted him as an exceptionally pious man who voluntarily gave up his inheritance to serve the Teutonic Order, where he was deployed to bring his brother, a condemned heretic, to justice. However, as the two fought on the battlefield, Berengar blinded Lambert with some vile sorcery before stabbing him in the back. This was the tale in which the Catholic Church told the world about Lambert and Berengar's duel within the battlefield of Oberstdorf. Obviously, it was completely fabricated, but unlike Adela, who now thought of herself as a reformist due to Berengar's influence, Ava was a devout Catholic much like the rest of her family and chose to further propagate this story, despite knowing its falsehood in a deliberate attempt to mess with Adela. Hearing such provoking words, Adela could not control herself and immediately lashed out at Ava, who had succeeded in her aim. You know full well that Lambert was a devious little scoundrel who on multiple occasions tried to murder Berengar. What was his punishment for such actions? He was disowned and sent to the Teutonic Order to redeem himself, where he used the first opportunity he could get to try to get revenge on Berengar for being merciful. If you ask me, Berengar should have cut off his head. To begin with, it would have saved everyone some trouble. Ava smiled devilishly as she witnessed Adela fuming with anger, to the point where her cheeks were puffing like a chipmunk and were slightly flushed. In Ava's eyes, it was adorable. After seeing such a sight, of course, Ava could not resist and further poured salt on the wound. I suppose that is the excuse he told you after stealing Lambert's fiancée and impregnating her, right? Adela continued to fume in anger, but she did not lose control of her emotions. Instead, she forced herself to calm down before addressing Ava's last point. For the past few months, ever since Ava arrived, she had continuously beaten Adela in any argument solely because she would bring up this point after being sorely defeated in the previous rounds of engagement and cause Adela to throw a tantrum. However, not this time. Adela had finally figured out how to beat Ava this time around, and she threw her words right back into her face. So what if Berengar has a lover? He is a great man, and plenty of great men have had multiple women by their side throughout history. If your husband was half as accomplished as Berengar, he too could take a lover, and I doubt you would mind. These words completely baffled Ava and attacked her weakest point. She knew her husband was not nearly as accomplished as Berengar, nor would he ever achieve half of the things Berengar had in life. Aside from coming from a powerful family and being slightly good-looking, her husband was a relatively dull and unambitious man. The fact that her youngest sister managed to get someone like Berengar as a fiancé had greatly invoked her ire, and it was her reason for picking on Adela all of the time. While Ava had an ugly expression on her face, Adela was smirking smugly at her. Oh, how the tables have turned. As for her husband, who was slightly older than Ava herself and was named Wolfgang von Salzburg, it took him a few moments to realize that Adela had essentially implied he was a loser. During that time, Ava lashed out at Adela as she pounded the table with her fists extremely uncivilly. You think you are better than me because your fiancé is extremely handsome, has never been defeated in battle, and is absurdly wealthy? How dare you? Adela was delighted at the moment. Ever since Ava had first arrived, she had continued to lose these daily catfights, but now the shoe was on the other foot. Apparently, Ava was a very sore loser. As such, Adela merely scoffed at Ava and told her the words she was told every time she erupted at Ava in the past. We will discuss this later when you calm down. If Ava's expression was ugly before, it was now outright hideous. She wanted to pounce at Adela on the spot, but she knew she could not do so. After all, such behavior was unladylike, and she had an image to maintain. As such, she quickly dug into the food on her plate while grumbling under her breath. Of course, it was at this moment Wolfgang finally realized that maybe there was a slight possibility that Adela had just insulted him, and as such, he whispered in Ava's ear asking about it. Did she just call me a loser? Ava nearly snapped at her husband's response. Not only was he dull enough not to realize that he was insulted, but he had the nerve to ask her about it in front of the perpetrator. She really wishes she was married off to someone more like Berengar. Though she looked down on Berengar for being born into low nobility, the more he accomplished, the more Ava became jealous of Adela. After all, who cares about whether someone is born into low nobility or not when they go from being a baron's son and heir to a count mighty enough to flip the bird to the Vatican in under a year? After this little catfight was over, the family's breakfast continued in awkward silence. The only one satisfied with the results of this meal was Adela. She had won a great moral victory today against her sister. Adela believed it was doubtful that Ava would mock Berengar further now that her weakness was exposed. As such, she enjoyed the thick German pancakes on her plate with delight. Chapter 164 Death of a Duke. For the past few months, Duke Wilmar of Austria has been in the process of conquering Bavaria. However, despite his initial progress, he currently found himself in a stalemate with the armies of Bavaria, which have returned from their campaign in northern Germany to reclaim the land in which they had lost to Austria. Despite the advantages the Austrians initially had in this war, they now found themselves struggling to maintain the ground they had conquered. The Bavarians had made great gains in northern Germany, pursuing their claim for the vacant throne. However, after realizing that the Austrians had stolen their capital, they were forced to withdraw from their holdings and leave it to reconquest by the House of Luxembourg and their allies. As such, they were in a furious state as they gazed across the battlefield to see the dastardly Austrians who had attacked them while they were pursuing their ambitions. The two dukes led their respective armies with Duke Wilmar von Habsburg in control of his personal forces and those of his vassals. Duke Dietger von Wittelsbach was in charge of the Bavarian army. Seeing as how nearly all of the two dukes' forces were gathered for this event, this would be the single most important battle of the war in southern Germany to decide who would reign supreme, Austria or Bavaria. The battle ultimately would take place outside the city of Passau in eastern Bavaria. Duke Wilmar was currently discussing the plans for the grand battle which was about to take place with his vassals, who were commanders in his army. Count Otto, my old friend, I wish for you to command the rearguard. Make sure that our flanks hold the line against any potential attack, especially that of cavalry. Seeing that he was not tasked with leading the vanguard, Otto frowned. However, despite his objections, he agreed to the Duke's orders and voiced his support. I will do as you command, your grace. Duke Wilmar was, of course, pleased with this result. As for the next comment from the Duke, it surprised nobody. Count Walfried von Salzburg, you are tasked with leading the vanguard. Walfried pounded his chest as he saluted his liege while responding to his orders. You honor me, your grace. With those two positions taken care of, Duke Wilmar moved on to his overall strategy. While Walfried advances with the vanguard, I will lead the cavalry, which we will split into two units and circle around the enemy's lines where we shall attack them from the rear of their flanks. Once the flanks are crushed, the Bavarians will have to fall back and reinforce their lines. As they do so, the vanguard will rush in and cut them down before they manage to do so. It was a simple enough strategy and had worked numerous times before. As such, none of the lords who were present had any complaints about the tactics they would use to defeat the Bavarians. The last remark the Duke made was about his archers. The archers will be placed atop both of these hills on both sides of the battlefield, where they will rain missiles down upon our foes. After these words were stated, all of the lords who witnessed this conversation nodded in agreement. Shortly thereafter, they were all set to the task, and the battle had begun. The archers took their positions on the hilltop and began to rain their arrows down upon the enemy forces, just as planned. However, unfortunately, it appeared as if the Bavarians were just as well equipped as the Austrians. As such, the arrows were largely deflected off of the heavily armored infantry of the enemy. The fact that the Bavarians were so well equipped was shocking to the Austrians, seeing as how the Austrian lords had spent a fortune on Berengar's arms and armor preparing for this war. Despite this fact, the Bavarians seemed to be equally well equipped, at least for the most part, which began to fill the lords of Austria with doubt over Berengar's loyalty. Nevertheless, now was not the time to worry about such concerns, and though the arrows could not pierce the brigandine or plate, they easily slid into the gaps in the enemy armor when fired in a volley numbering in the thousands. There were still many wounds inflicted on the Bavarian troops before they arrived in combat with the Austrian infantry. Still, it was strange that there was no sign of Bavarian archers or crossbowmen deployed to the battlefield, which filled Count Otto with angst as he commanded the rearguard, watching the battle from afar. The moment the two feudal armies made contact with one another, blood and death began to spray about the fertile grassland that was the battlefield. Corpses littered the field as the steel-clad armies clashed with one another like an enormous metallic tidal wave. As the battle continued to rage, Duke Wilmar finally found an opening for his cavalry, and as such, he began his charge. Just like in the battle plan, the heavily armored knights mounted on horseback broke into two units and went around the vanguard of the enemy army, where they proceeded to attack their flanks from the rear. With their lances couched, and the force of the horses' charge, even high-quality steel plate armor could be damaged by such a powerful blow. As such, the heavily armored knights of Austria led by Duke Wilmar crashed into the enemy flanks, driving their lances through their chests and ending their lives. Quickly the Bavarian flanks began to crumble, and the plan seemed to be working perfectly. However, unlike Duke Wilmar had estimated, the moment the enemy flanks crumbled, the men began to rout and fled into the distance. Seeing this as an opportunity for victory, Duke Wilmar charged ahead of his infantry and into the routing forces. However, this turned out to be a grave mistake, as the enemy forces were pulling a classic feigned retreat. By the time the Knights of Austria arrived in front of their enemies, they were encircled by thousands of crossbowmen and archers who unleashed a massive volley from 360 degrees around the Austrian knights. Though the bolts of the crossbows could not penetrate the toughness of the steel-plate armor, they could get into the gaps between them, causing injuries to the knights and noblemen who were encapsulated, as well as their trusty steeds. Before long, the entire contingent of knights who had broken the Bavarian flanks found themselves dismounted as the continuous volley fire had gravely injured their horses. Many of them were wounded or had even perished in the attack by the crossbowmen. After all, the plate armor of the time was not as advanced as what Berniger equipped his cavalry with. Many knights wore mail aventails for throat protection, rather than gorget or great bassinet, which allotted some degree of steel plate throat protection. Thus the crossbow bolts of the heavy steel crossbows were capable of piercing through the mail aventail and into their throats. Duke Wilmar and his surviving knights quickly recovered from the attack. However, they soon found themselves surrounded by the enemy infantry, and they were a long way off from their own army. As such, a vicious struggle appeared as the Knights of Austria battled to the death with the men-at-arms of Bavaria. Where the Bavarian knights were located Wilmar did not know. Though the Austrian knights were afforded greater protection and had better skill than the Bavarian men-at-arms, they were severely outnumbered. They quickly found their ranks dwindling as they were surrounded on all sides and ruthlessly battered by the Bavarian forces. Duke Wilmar stood side by side with his knights and vassals, who had followed him into death as he parried an oncoming spear thrust and lunged towards the soldier's face with his longsword, piercing through the man's skull and ending his life. However, he shortly thereafter received a crossbow bolt in the crook of his elbow, which pierced through the gap beneath his plate armor and through the mail and gambeson which protected it. With a massive bolt piercing through his elbow, he no longer had the ability to wield his longsword with his dominant arm and thus resorted to using the weapon one-handed with his offhand. Count Otto gazed in horror at the sight of the Austrian knights being rapidly cut down by the enemy forces, yet there was nothing he could do. He was tasked with protecting the rear guard, and he was far too distant from his liege's position to provide any aid. All he could do was watch as the ranks of the Austrian knights slowly dwindled in a desperate struggle to wait for the Austrian infantry to arrive at their aid. However, right when the Austrian infantry was about to intervene, the Bavarian cavalry rushed upon their loose and disorganized ranks, which was the result of panic, and began to halt their advance. Duke Dieter was at the head of the ranks of his cavalry as they lanced through the Austrian vanguard as if they were cutting through cream cheese. The last thing Duke Wilmar saw before he was viciously struck upon the back of his helm with a mighty warhammer was the devastation wrought upon his forces by the Bavarian army. He quickly collapsed to his knees from the impact, where he was once more struck by the warhammer, ending his life. As for the fate of Count Walfried von Salzburg, he had either perished in the conflict or been captured alive. To Count Otto, such a thing did not matter at the moment. Despite being his daughter's father-in-law, Otto had no plans to stay behind and rescue the man. As such, he quickly ordered his troops to withdraw from the battlefield, for the Austrian army had already lost. With this one battle, the fate of Austria had seemingly been sealed, the Duke was dead, and his armies were routed. Those few who survived and remained free from bondage were the members of the rear guard who watched their armies cut to pieces. When all appeared to be lost, they fled the battle scene and headed back to their homes in Austria. After all, someone had to defend the homeland from the massive Bavarian invasion of Austria that would soon follow. Chapter 165 Preparing for an Enemy Invasion. Nearly a week had passed from the fateful battle in which the Austrian army under the command of Duke Wilmar was horrendously defeated by the Bavarians. Count Otto had maintained his army's march back to Graz, where he intended to defend his home and family until death. As for the result of the battle, Count Otto had dispatched messengers and carrier pigeons to all corners of Austria, informing the realm of their liege's death and the results of the catastrophic battle. When Berengar finally received the news, He was sitting on his seat of power, with Lind on his lap, where he was in the process of teasing her. He indeed had no shame as he continued to grope her exquisitely proportioned figure through her velvet dress, which caused her to flush with arousal. Truthfully, this entire public display of intimacy was her idea, and Berengar was her lord, and master would not decline an opportunity to show off his dominance. As such, the young count entertained himself with the voluptuous body of his lover. That is until a messenger came rushing into the great hall and witnessed the erotic scene. Upon witnessing the intruder, Lind quickly became overwhelmed with embarrassment and hid her charming face with her hands. Nevertheless, Berengar continued to play with her ample bosom despite the new arrival. While behaving so shamelessly in public, Berengar shouted at the messenger who had just arrived. "Do you have something important to tell me? If not, get out. As you can see, I am currently preoccupied." Not knowing how to react to the bold scene in front of him, the messenger stammered as he tried to discuss the letter which had arrived, containing the seal of House von Gratz. "Why? Your Excellency, Count Otto von Gratz sends an urgent message. I am here to deliver it." Berengar's hand, which was latched to one of Linda's large breasts, immediately stopped what it was doing and released its grip. Shortly thereafter, a sigh escaped from his lips as he demanded the messenger pass the letter to him. "Hand it over." The messenger quickly bowed before walking up to Berengar and Lind, where he handed it to the young count whose arm was still wrapped firmly around his lover's waist, preventing her from fleeing the scene. After the man handed Berengar the letter, he quickly absconded from the spot. After all, watching Berengar openly play with Lind on his seat of power was not something to which one would normally stick around to see. It was only after the man had left that Lind released her hands from blocking her gorgeous face, where she began to pout. She truly only had herself to blame, as she was the one who suggested such an open display of intimacy. Nevertheless, she still felt Berengar had gone too far by not immediately stopping his actions with the arrival of a third party. Ignoring Linda's cute reactions, Berengar opened up the letter and read its contents, which caused his eyes to spread open with shock before settling into a grave expression. Seeing his reaction, Lind could not help but pry into his business. After all, she was his spymaster, and as such, she quickly voiced her concerns. "I know that look. Something serious has happened, has it not?" Berengar nodded his head before announcing the results of the battle outside Passau. "The Duke is dead, his army was crushed in Passau, only Count Otto and his forces have returned from the battlefield. The lords of Austria are either dead or captured. I'm sorry, love, but I have more important things to attend to at the moment. I will have to play with you again some other time." Lind once more began to pout as Berengar forced her up from his lap and began to head to his study. They had only just begun their fun, and yet already he was leaving. She began to believe that such news always presented itself at the worst timing. She sighed to herself as she watched Berengar leave the scene. However, it could not be helped. He had to make preparations for the likelihood of a Bavarian invasion into Tyrol. As such, she decided she would spend her free time feeding her child. Berengar, on the other hand, quickly got to work. Though star forts had begun construction across Tyrol, he had always made a priority on the construction of forts in the border regions and within Kufstein. As such, the borders were adequately defended, at least in terms of fortifications. However, he now needed to transfer more forces to their garrisons after all the Bavarians were likely to invade through Tyrol with at least one army. By now, Eckhard had already returned to Berengar's court. As his field marshal, Berengar liked to have him nearby to advise on strategies and tactics. As such, Berengar quickly called for Eckhard to meet him in his study, where the man arrived in a timely manner. Initially, Eckhard thought Berengar wanted to have a midday drink. After all, the two men had become close friends throughout the vast amount of time they spent together. However, after noticing the grave expression on Berengar's face, Eckhard's professionalism immediately took over. "Your Excellency, what has happened?" Berengar immediately relayed the news he had become privy to. "The Duke is dead, and the Austrian host was shattered. Only a few thousand troops made it out of the battle, and they returned to Graz with Count Otto. Vienna is left poorly defended after Lothar's rebellion, and it will not stand for long if the Bavarians decide to invade." Hearing such disastrous news, Eckhard frowned. By now, he knew where Berengar was headed with this train of thought. As such, he asked Berengar the question on his mind. "Yet you do not plan to provide relief to the new duke?" Berengar grinned as he heard Eckhard's response. The man knew him too well. Of course not, though the Bavarians may send an army into Vienna, they will undoubtedly also send one into our lands as well. After all, Tyrol exists along the southern border of Bavaria, and I doubt they plan to leave us out of their conquests. We must properly defend ourselves. Eckhard nodded. The situation of the Duchy of Austria did not bode too well. However, as the Count of Tyrol, Berengar's first and foremost responsibility was to protect his own lands, which was the wisest course of action in such uncertain times. However, an idea popped into Eckhard's head as he thought about what would happen to Austria. What if the armies march on Steiermark? Will you leave your little fiancée to her fate? Berengar scoffed at Eckhard's suggestion and immediately retorted. If those Bavarian bastards dare to think about laying a hand on Adela, I will bring the might of steel and shot upon their feudal armies. I will never allow harm to come to a single strand upon either of my women's heads. Eckhard stared at the conviction in Berengar's eyes and knew the young count was serious. Despite Steiermark being a rather distant county of Austria, at least relative to Tyrol, the grizzled veteran did not doubt for a second that Berengar would break any siege that took place in Graz and forcefully take his fiancée with him back to Kufstein, where she would be safe. With that in mind, the man had decided on the best course of actions in which Berengar's army would take and pointed to the map of Tyrol. We will split the field army into two forces. As you know, we have mostly replenished our losses from the battle with the Teutonic Order, and as such, our numbers are back to their peak. 7,500 men will march up to Root with Arnulf as their commander, where they will be stationed as a rapid response force to any invasion through our northwest borders. As for the other 7,500 men, they will be stationed in Kitzbühel, where I will lead them. If the Bavarians even dare to attack our northeastern border, I will crush them. As for any attacks on our allies in Steiermark, we will be able to more swiftly get to their aid by having our troops stationed in Kitzbühel. It was a good plan, and Berengar immediately agreed with it. As such, he complimented Eckhard before ordering him to put it into action as soon as possible. Excellent work, Marshal Eckhard. With this strategy, we should be able to defend our borders from any incursion adequately. Relay this information to the army and have it enacted as quickly as you can. Eckhard nodded with a smile on his face before saluting Berengar. Of course, Your Excellency. I will dispatch the army at once. Afterward, the man exited from Berengar's office and began to enact the plans promptly. Berengar's defenses were rather solid, and though most of the star forts were still under construction and would be for years to come, the border defenses were at least partially completed. As such, he did not fear the Bavarians seizing his land. Chapter 166 The way is blocked. Rain poured down upon the mountainous borders of Tyrol and Bavaria. At the moment, an army of Bavarians was on the march. At the head of the military was a count who was quite upset about his current task. For the most part, he and the men of his army were proud members of the German Reformation, and Duke Dietger had tasked them to invade the heartland of their movement. Not only was Tyrol an important place in the hearts of German reformists, but it also housed two of their leaders, that being Berengar and Ludolf. As such, very few men in the army were eager to fulfill this task. On more than one occasion, this count by the name of Siegmund had considered outright insubordination. Yet, here he was at the borders between his homeland and the capital of the Reformation, debating whether or not he should go through with his orders. However, the closer his troops approached Tyrol, the more they were able to notice that a fortress was constructed in the area, one whose design was unlike anything Siegmund had ever seen before. It was in the shape of a star and flew the coat of arms of House von Kufstein. It was a fortress constructed by Berengar to protect the routes into his lands. Siegmund decided to halt his advance when faced with such a mighty fortress, which was visibly defended by relatively massive cannons and hundreds of men armed with what he perceived to be hand cannons. He was no fool, and he could tell by the design of the fortress that if he were to attempt to take it over, it would be a long and bloody battle. Not only were his men vulnerable to fire from all directions, but there were no blind spots to take advantage of. If rumors were to be believed, the hand cannons in which the defenders were equipped were devastating weapons. When faced with such a challenge, Siegmund only had three options. First and foremost, he could withdraw from the region and find another route into Tyrol, one he hoped would not be as heavily defended. The second option was for him to disregard his losses and attack the fortress in an attempt to force his way into Tyrol. His third and final option was to give up on the idea of attacking the region, and set up camp on the edge of the border, and act like he was doing something, hoping that his liege would not realize he had sat still and done nothing. After all, neither he nor his men were too keen on the idea of attacking Tyrol. Count Siegmund von Augsburg took a few moments to contemplate his options when one of his commanders approached him. "Your Excellency, the path forward is blocked by the strange fortress. I fear as if it will be a difficult task to invade Tyrol." Count Siegmund immediately felt a headache looking at the situation before him. If he did not advance into Tyrol, he would be labeled an oath-breaker, and after the war was over, Duke Dietger would surely come for him and potentially his family. As such, he mustered his courage and ordered the army to advance on the fortress. "Prepare to lay siege to the fortress. We have our orders." While giving out the command to his army, Siegmund told himself in the back of his mind, "May God have mercy on my soul." As such, a siege camp was prepared, and within a few hours of preparations, the Bavarian army began to attack the Star Fortress. Men-at-arms rushed towards the fortress curtains, hoping that the solid portion of the wall would provide a steady platform to raise their ladders. However, the moment they came within engagement distance, the several hundred soldiers of Berengar's army who were garrisoned at the fort unleashed the 24-pound siege cannons onto the invaders. The explosive shells tore the besiegers asunder long before they made it to the wall section, which was their goal. Limbs were hewn from the victims of the blast, and blood splattered across the grassy mountain pass. Yet this did not stop the dozens of cannons mounted on the fortress walls from firing in the direction of the invaders. The thundering echoes of the guns filled the air alongside the blood-curdling screams of the invaders. Though the defenders only numbered in the hundreds, the fortress was so well designed that even with their 14-17 land-pattern smoothbore muskets, they were capable of causing massive devastation to the enemy forces. By the time the third volley of cannon fire went off, the besiegers had fled back to their siege camp, which was unbeknownst to them well within the range of the mighty 24-pound cannons. However, the defenders did not attack the encampment. Instead, they halted their fire and allowed the enemy to retreat. The goal was not to annihilate the enemy force as quickly as possible. If they did such a thing, Duke Dietger would take one of two actions. He would either abandon Tyrol altogether until he had successfully taken all of Austria excluding Tyrol, or he would send a massive invasion far more significant than the current force in retaliation. Neither of which was appealing to Berengar. As such, the young Count of Tyrol had tasked his defenders to wage a war of attrition. If Berengar's forces could keep these tens of thousands of men bogged down outside their borders indefinitely, Duke Dietger would surely continue to send reinforcements and supplies to ensure the offensive against Tyrol continued. This would significantly weaken their attack on the remainder of Austria and divide his armies, allowing the Austrian lords a decent chance to fight back. However, Count Siegmund had no way of knowing Berengar's plans and was simply in awe of the weapons that his opponents fielded. Thus he stood with his mouth agape after watching his army collapse so quickly against the mighty Star Fortress. The man was so shocked by the disastrous result of the brief engagement that he accidentally voiced his thoughts aloud for all the nearby men to hear. God is on their side, for how can man build such destructive weapons without divine intervention? These words weakened the already low morale of the troops, many of which were reformists, and had no desire to attack the heartland of their religion. After saying these words, one of the commanders under Siegmund voiced his concerns. If God is on their side, then how do we fulfill our orders? It was only at this moment that Siegmund realized he had spoken his thoughts aloud, and as such, quickly came up with a scheme to avoid further conflict while making it seem like he was actively participating in an attempt to seize Tyrol. Write to Duke Dietger, tell him the northwest passages into Tyrol are blocked by mighty fortresses, and we need reinforcements if we are to achieve our objective. He will either send us aid, which will give us a period of reprieve, or he will ignore our pleas, and we will have our justification to sit back and do nothing. Hearing their liege's orders, the commanders all agreed that it was the best course of action and immediately set to task. As for the defenders in the fortress, not a single man was wounded in the conflict, and as such, they were sitting back and relaxing. After all, they had access to plenty of supplies and relieving forces. Theoretically, they could stay and guard the northwest borders of Tyrol indefinitely. While the besiegers lived in an exposed and muddy siege camp, the defenders stayed in fine barracks to shelter them from the elements, which allowed them a sense of comfort as they guarded the borders of Tyrol. The stalemate at the Tyrolean border had just begun, and this star fortress was not the only one facing a similar situation. To the northeast near the edges of Kitzbühel, the defenders were also facing a similar problem. After all, the attempted invasion into Tyrol was a two-prong offensive designed to encapsulate the region swiftly. However, in its initial advancement, it had been completely halted. When Duke Dietger finally found out that his troops could not penetrate Tyrolean territory, he would be shocked that his strategy had failed so miserably. However, the sunk cost fallacy was a severe issue of the human psyche, and the old duke would surely continue to send aid towards the besiegers of Tyrol at his own army's expense. As for the rest of the invasion of Austria, aside from Vorarlberg, the remainder of the Austrian counties were not as lucky as Tyrol to have its natural defensive barriers, and as such, would fare far worse in the ongoing invasion. As the war progressed, Tyrol would become the symbol of Austrian resistance against Bavarian occupation, and Berengar would gain recognition as the leader of said resistance. As for now, the Bavarian invasion had just begun, and as such, no county had yet fallen to the enemy. While the attempts to invade Tyrol had been halted in their initial advance, Berengar was sleeping peacefully in the arms of his lover. Chapter 167: Henrietta's Concerns. The light of dawn shone into Berengar's room, exposing the scene of the young count and his lover entangled in each other's arms. As per usual, this was the signal for Berengar to awaken. As for Lind, she would continue to sleep for some time. The days of her waking up early to sneak back to her temporary quarters were long past. These days, everyone knew of her relationship with Berengar, and she openly slept in his room. As such, she could sleep in as long as she wanted, and Berengar never complained. Thus Berengar skillfully climbed out of bed, without awakening Lind, and got dressed in his athletic attire. As per usual, his morning was filled with a 5-mile run, followed by lifting weights and sword practice. When he was finally done with all of those things, hours had passed, and he had entered the bath to get rid of all the sweat on his body. When he opened the door to the tub and entered the pool of water, he found Lind already enjoying herself within. A large smile appeared on her face as Berengar sat down alongside her and enjoyed the steaming water. After a prolonged workout, soaking in a hot tub was something that Berengar had come to enjoy immensely. After fooling around in the tub with Lind for some time, the couple left the bath and tidied up their appearance while fulfilling daily hygiene like brushing their teeth and flossing. Afterward, they got dressed and headed to the dining room, where they shared a meal. As per usual, the only other person present at the table was Henrietta, who had long since grown accustomed to Lind being present, and though their relationship had improved, she still supported Adela in her little rivalry with Lind. Adela, of course, had not been back to Kufstein since she left so many months ago. Berengar had yet to inform Henrietta of Lambert's death at his hands in the Battle of Oberstdorf. Of course, when he did finally tell her of such an important matter, it would be an entirely fabricated story about the boy dying in the glorious crusade against the Golden Horde. After all, Henrietta had always cared for both of her brothers, and she was still not fully aware of the evil in which Lambert had done in his life. Being a young child, it seemed unfair to Berengar to reveal to the girl the truth behind Lambert's misdeeds and the cause of his death. Thus he chose to allow his little sister to remember Lambert in a good light, at least until she was old enough to properly understand the depth of his actions and his wicked character. As such, Berengar drank out of the skull chalice, which was fashioned from his little brother's skull, while talking to Henrietta about how she spent her time recently. "So Henrietta, how have you been lately? I have been so preoccupied with work that I have been unable to check up on you." Henrietta had been attending classes at one of the public institutions which had been set up in the city of Kufstein to educate the young generations. After all, if she stayed cooped up in the castle of Kufstein with no contact with children her age, she was bound to have some issues properly socializing later in life. Thus Henrietta had a giant smile on her face as she devoured the delectable omelette on her plate. The omelette itself was filled with spinach and cheese and had become one of the girl's favorite breakfast dishes. However, the moment she heard this, her expression soured slightly, which did not go unnoticed by Berengar and Lind. "I am fine." Henrietta was a rather shy girl, and as such, she did not like revealing too much about her personal life. However, Berengar was persistent and made sure to pry into the girl's life. As such, he asked another question. "Are you enjoying school? Does everyone treat you well?" Henrietta nodded as she snacked more on her breakfast. She did not say much other than, "Despite her answer, Berengar did not believe that to be the case. After all, he knew his little sister reasonably well and, as such, became deeply concerned. It was not simply a matter of being shy. Ever since Berengar got his eye patch and began drinking from a skull chalice, he had an aura of intimidation around him, which made Henrietta subconsciously afraid of him. As such, she acted as an obedient little lamb and merely nodded her head and answered Berengar's questions. Noticing such behavior, Lind put a gentle smile on her face and questioned the girl on Berengar's behalf. She was a far less frightening character in Henrietta's eyes, and as such, the girl was more open to talking to her. "It is okay. Why don't you tell me if you have any concerns?" Henrietta's gaze switched between Berengar and Lind for a few moments before she finally opened up about her problems with her school life. Due to being cooped up in the castle most of her life, Henrietta's was, as previously mentioned, a timid girl, and as such, she did not know how to interact well with others. Berengar's worst fears about her upbringing had already become realized, and as such, Henrietta revealed her difficulties at school. "I don't have any friends." With this information revealed, Berengar was not entirely surprised. He had deliberately put her in his public education program so she could socialize and become accustomed to the common populace, but she was still the Count's little sister. There was a natural air of intimidation that surrounded her, at least as far as the ordinary people were concerned. The parents probably instructed their kids not to do anything to upset her. When combined with her naturally shy and docile personality, she most likely sat alone in a class all day and simply went over her school work. It seemed Berengar's guesses were correct as Lind further questioned the young girl. "Well, have you tried talking to anyone in your class?" Henrietta merely shook her head in response to this question, causing Lind to put on a warm smile once more. "Well, maybe you should try it out?" Henrietta's response was quick and filled with dejection. "It won't matter." Lind tried to dig to the root of the problem, and as such, further questioned Henrietta's response. "Why not?" Henrietta's expression turned gloomy, which was rather adorable on her cute little face, at least as far as Berengar was concerned. However, she muttered in a hushed voice. "Because I am the Count's little sister." Though she was quiet, the large dining room was virtually silent aside from her voice, and Berengar and Lind both heard her complaint. Now it was Berengar's turn to cheer her up, and he finally voiced his opinion on the matter. "It sounds to me like the other kids might be a little bit intimidated by your position. I'm willing to bet you don't voluntarily interact with any of them, and you simply sit there in class with an indifferent expression on your face. Am I right?" Berengar knew his sister all too well, and he had guessed correctly. Henrietta squeezed her favorite doll that she carried with her everywhere into her arms and pouted. Berengar was right on the money, and she felt like she was being scolded. However, what he said next gave her some hope. "Why don't you try introducing yourself to your classmates? I know you are shy, but if you make a sincere effort, they might stop thinking of you as a little ice princess who should not be offended and instead treat you as part of the class. I am sure the girls in your class would love to talk about your cute dresses." Hearing this, Henrietta continued to pout until finally, she uttered a single phrase. "I doubt that." Berengar laughed at the little lowly's cute expression and decided to counter her words. "Is that so? Then what are the girls in your class interested in talking about?" Henrietta's face slightly flushed as she recalled the subject the girls in her class were constantly talking about and immediately looked away from Berengar, which deeply confused him. As for Lind, she had a general idea of what the popular topic was among the little girls of Kufstein and merely smiled as Berengar tried to wrap his head around it. After a few seconds of contemplation, Berengar could not figure it out and promptly asked again. "Henrietta, what are the girls in your class interested in?" Hearing the authoritative voice of the Count speaking to her in such a forceful manner, Henrietta nearly jumped out of her seat from fright. However, she merely turned her head to look back between Berengar and Lind before muttering a single word. "You?" Berengar did not believe he heard correctly, and as such, he asked her one more time. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Henrietta was already thoroughly embarrassed by the conversation and shouted out what she had said in a fit. "You. The girls in my class always talk about you." Now it was Berengar's turn to be embarrassed. This was not exactly a demographic he wanted to be popular with. As such, he turned to Lind looking for advice, who was merely smirking at his misfortune before teasing him. "My oh my, to believe my man is so popular with little girls." Hearing that phrase, Berengar immediately wished he was a turtle so that he could hide in his shell. It was indeed something he had never expected in life. Though he was popular among the women of Kufstein, for many reasons, chiefly among them were his good looks, his charismatic personality, and the fact that he had achieved so much in life despite being only 21 years old. He never thought the girls Henrietta's age would be talking about him as if he was some form of Prince Charming. As such, Berengar merely cleared his throat before putting on a professional act and began giving Henrietta some advice. Well, you should fit right in then. I mean, after all, who knows more about me than my precious little sister? Surely you must know some juicy details that the girls of your class will be interested in? Use that as an icebreaker, and then try to find some common interests. Lind laughed faintly at Berengar's reaction. Despite being embarrassed by the situation, he still managed to turn it around in Henrietta's favor. After pondering about it for a moment, Henrietta realized Berengar was right. If the girls in her class all treated her brother like he was a dashing prince, then she could talk about him to gather their interest, and from there, they could talk about other things. As such, she no longer felt embarrassed and smiled gratefully at Berengar. Thanks, big brother. Despite his more intimidating appearance nowadays, he was still the kind and caring big brother she had grown up with, which made Henrietta happy. Now that she had a way to make friends at school, Henrietta and the others enjoyed the rest of their meal in peace. As for Berengar, he was cursing his luck for being so popular with girls of all ages. The last thing he needed was another reason for Lind to tease him, and she would indeed never allow him to live this down. Chapter 168 Constructing the Grand Cathedral. While Berengar was enjoying a peaceful life in Tyrol, the Bavarian invasion had spread to the other corners of Austria. Luckily for Berengar, his position was secure for the moment. As such, he spent his time overseeing the usual activities. After finishing his breakfast with Lind and Henrietta, which had taken an unusual turn, Berengar had moved on to the main highlight of his day, which was presenting the architectural designs of his newest project to his favorite architect. With the German Reformation in full effect, Berengar wanted a symbol of his movement. As such, he decided to make a grand cathedral in Kufstein to represent the new era of Christianity. While Berengar was far from an artist, he still could draw some rudimentary architectural blueprints. The style he had in mind was that of the German Renaissance. Berengar had already begun implementing such designs across Kufstein for all of his major architectural projects, for example, his Grand Palace, which was primarily based upon the designs of the Schloss Johannesburg from his previous life. As such, he was currently in a meeting with his favorite architect who had been overseeing a lot of his projects within Kufstein. The man's name was Burckhardt, and he was a refugee who had fled to Kufstein during the early days of the war in Germany, where Berengar immediately noticed his talents and put him to work. At the moment, the two men discussing the details of the Grand Cathedral with each other as they went over the designs. Burckhardt being the first to voice his opinion. As usual, Your Excellency, you know how to build a basic blueprint, but are completely lacking in creativity. I am afraid to say you are without any form of artistic talent. Burckhardt was a man in his early 50s. He was an unusually blunt man. Even to someone of Berengar's position, he was not afraid of voicing his true thoughts, which Berengar honestly enjoyed. Berengar was constantly surrounded by too many sycophants who told him exactly what he wanted to hear and not the reality he needed to hear. As such, Berengar merely laughed at the older man's comment and expressed his concerns. Yeah, I know I am not meant to be an artist. The question is, can you make something magnificent with the designs I have presented you? The older man with long overflowing gray hair and steel blue eyes began to contemplate for a few moments while rubbing his bare chin before sighing. It will take a lot of work to fix your mistakes, but I promise you, by the time I am done with this grand cathedral of yours, it will put anything the Vatican has to shame. Berengar chuckled upon hearing the man's confidence and patted him on the back as he brought the topic to interior design. For the interior, I was thinking stained glass windows. I have a soft spot for such things. Burckhardt snorted when he heard those words before interjecting his opinion on the matter. Of course you want stained glass windows. Everyone wants stained glass windows in their cathedrals. Far be it from me to question Your Excellency's brilliant mind. Burckhardt was bitter about the topic, though Berengar did not know why, and frankly, he did not care so long as his vision was brought to life. Thus Berengar switched the topic to the time frame it would take to complete it. How long will it take to be finished? Burckhardt immediately scoffed at Berengar's remarks. The young count was always rushing him on his projects. Despite the vast wealth and resources at his disposal, it was not like the man could pull a miracle and complete such a large project overnight. Despite his inner monologue, Burckhardt gave his best estimate. Considering you have me running around the clock building your palace, and now I have this damn cathedral on top of it, it will take at least 2 years. You are lucky you pay me so well and allow me the freedom to express my creativity with these designs, or else I would have quit long ago. Berengar was not the slightest bit upset by the level of informality in which the architect spoke to him. In fact, it was pretty refreshing listening to someone who did not bow and express meaningless flattery in every comment they made. As such, Berengar let the man's seemingly foul attitude slide. In reality, Burckhardt was very passionate about his work and was glad to have the near unlimited resources at his disposal which Berengar provided him to design and construct so many grand projects. Not to mention the freedom in which he was allowed to tinker with the rudimentary designs Berengar had provided him, thus giving him the opportunity to turn them into true masterpieces. Burckhardt was right about one thing. Though it might take 2 years at the earliest to complete, it would be far grander than anything the Vatican had at the moment, and as such, the man was immensely proud to stick it to those old fools who had denied him his dreams when he was a young man. The Vatican once hired Burckhardt to construct a project for them. However, the cardinals in charge of the project micromanaged every step of his creative process and, in his opinion, ruined the final result. As such, he was glad to see those old bastards get a taste of their own medicine. Berengar, on the other hand, was a much more convenient employer. As long as the result was fantastic, the young count could care less if it stuck faithfully to his original design. This was how Berengar outsourced all of his creative ideas, especially in the textile industry. Those with more artistic talent than himself were allowed to be creative with the basic concept he presented, resulting in styles based upon the clothing of the Renaissance from his previous life. However, maybe not 100% historically correct, nevertheless, they still ended up looking fantastic and selling well, and those two things were all that mattered in the end. After hearing that it would take at least 2 years to finish construction, Berengar was pleased. It usually would take years, maybe even decades, to construct such an extensive project. However, Berengar had introduced essential materials that significantly reduced construction speed and increased structural integrity over the traditional form of masonry. That was, of course, structural steel and concrete. With these two materials, his construction crews could create grand projects such as this cathedral in a far shorter time frame, with greatly enhanced sturdiness, especially when compared to the traditional methods. If one knew what they were doing, they could make a steel-reinforced concrete building look as attractive as any other building. As such, Berengar made use of these advanced construction materials to build his city rapidly as well as his defenses. Despite being pleased with the estimated time frame, Berengar liked to mess with the older man. Considering Burckhardt's naturally crotchety attitude, Berengar put on an authoritative facade and said in a stern voice, "That is too long. It needs to be constructed in half that time." Upon hearing such an impossible task, Burckhardt nearly had an aneurysm as a large vein protruded from his forehead while he was seething with anger. However, before long, Berengar broke out into laughter after seeing the older man's twisted expression, and Burckhardt instantly realized that Berengar was screwing with his head. As such, he forced himself to calm down and responded to Berengar's jest. "You know you are not half as funny as you think you are, right?" Berengar, however, had a great smile across his lips. The look on Burckhardt's face just now was priceless. After all, Burckhardt was one of the few people he knew who he could joke around with like this. With others, Berengar had to maintain his prestigious appearance, yet Burckhardt was different. He did not care in the slightest for the face of the nobility, and as such, Berengar could be himself around the older man. Of course, Burckhardt also found Berengar to be one of the more tolerable members of the nobility he had met. While the man was a member of the lower nobility, he was always looked down on for his lowly status, and as such, never cared for the noblemen and women who commissioned his work. However, he respected Berengar to a degree. Berengar was born to a lower noble house, a mere baron's son, and yet in under a year, he made himself a count. This was not an easy feat in this medieval world. After playing his prank on Burckhardt, Berengar noticed what time it was and realized he had to be at a strategy meeting in a few moments, and as such, he let Burckhardt get back to work. "Well, Burckhardt, as always, it has been a pleasure, but I am afraid I am needed elsewhere. I will let you get back to your work." Burckhardt snorted when he heard this and responded in a cold manner. Just make sure I am paid properly. Berengar chuckled when he heard this response and walked away, leaving a rhetorical question in his wake. Have I ever failed in that regard? With that, Burckhardt was left with a basic outline for Berengar's Grand Cathedral, and he had a lot of work to do on revising the design into a proper blueprint before he could begin construction. Of course, this cathedral was not the only project he had to work on. After all, the palace was still under construction, thus the man had his work cut out for him. However, he was pretty happy with his place in Kufstein and had no plans to leave. As such, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work on the new project presented to him. In the distant future, Kufstein would be considered not only the seat of imperial power of Germany but also the religious center of the German Reformation, mainly in part to the efforts of Burckhardt. Chapter 169 Catfight 2. While the Bavarians were halted at the Tyrolean border, the same could not be said for the rest of the Duchy of Austria. At the moment, the Duke of Bavaria's forces were laying siege to Salzburg. The Count of the region was missing in action. Nobody knew if he was alive or dead after the battle in Passau, and his eldest son was currently staying within Graz with his wife and 3 children. The defense of the county of Salzburg was left to the second son of Count, who was slightly more intelligent than Wolfgang but was by no means a genius, let alone a master of military strategy. As such, the region was in dire straits while it faced the Bavarian forces. Wolfgang's younger brother Adelbrand opted to give his troops the orders to stay within their castles and fortresses, challenging the Bavarians to fight them where they had the advantage. On paper, this might seem like a good idea. However, in reality, this left the towns and villages that provided the food to the castles, cities, and fortresses completely defenseless, resulting in the raiding, raping, and burning of Salzburg's common population by the invasive Bavarians. Of course, Wolfgang had no way of knowing what was going on in his family's territory, nor did he really care. After Otto arrived with his armies and secured Steiermark, the fearful man opted to stay with his in-laws, allowing the lands that should be under his protection to burn in the fires of war. This, of course, infuriated Eva as she had yet another dispute with her little sister. Since their last catfight, Adela had been increasingly winning the little battles she had with Eva to the point where Eva would rather stay in the castle in Salzburg than continue to be insulted in this manner. However, once more, Eva decided to provoke a fight with Adela now that she had nowhere else to return to. At the moment, the 2 women were standing in the grand hall fighting over, well, frankly, nothing of importance. I am just saying, where is Berengar when we need him the most? He supposedly has an army capable of wiping out 30,000 men of the Teutonic Order, and yet he hides in his mountainous territory like a coward. If he is as great as a man as you claim, he should be leading the charge against the Bavarians, and yet Salzburg bleeds while he sits back and does nothing. Adela pouted after hearing her eldest sister slander Berengar once more and quickly countered her remark. Berengar is the Count of Tyrol, and as such he is currently protecting his lands from the invasion of the Bavarians. According to our father, he has completely halted the enemy's advance into Tyrol and is currently maintaining his field armies in the event that the Bavarians break past his fortifications. He is doing far more for his family's lands and the people within it than your cowardly husband. Now that Adela knew her sister's weakness, she made every remark a stake to the heart, which greatly wounded Eva's pride, and in all reality, she was correct. Rather than deal with his own enemies, Wolfgang hid in Graz under the protection of Otto's armies while his lands were torched and his people massacred by the Bavarians. Of course, even if he did show up to counter the enemy, there was not much an inbred dullard like Wolfgang could do about the situation. Still, Eva was greatly dissatisfied with her husband's behavior, and of course, Adela took advantage of that. Eva was scowling at Adela's remark, yet she quickly offered a retort. After all, much like Adela, she was privy to Otto's intelligence about the situation in Austria. However, Berengar had taken borderline paranoid lengths to remove spies and scouts of other powers from his territory. With his vast intelligent network, a part of it was dedicated solely to counterintelligence, and as such, gaining information on the events in Tyrol was quite difficult. Mostly they had to go with the intercepted messages they took from the Bavarians. According to father's reports, Berengar is sitting back in Kufstein enjoying himself with his lover and bastard child while his armies defend his borders. Just how exactly are those the actions of a great man as you proclaim him to be? Eva had a point. Berengar was not currently at the front lines as he had always been in the past, but the reason for this was simple. His army was a well-oiled machine, and the garrisons were explicitly trained to defend their star fortresses in the most effective means possible. Their commanding officers were battle-hardened veterans from Berengar's campaign in Tyrol and knew full well how to siege a fortress and how to defend one. There would be no purpose other than morale for Berengar to stay at one of his defending forts. The men were already in high spirits due to the exceptional conditions they found themselves in and the minimal losses they suffered. No matter how many times the enemy rushed at the star fortresses, the combination of rifled and smoothbore muskets alongside the 24-pound cannons was enough to quickly repel any attempted invasion. When one could repel an invasion in under an hour and spend the rest of the day playing cards and drinking tea while munching on biscuits and cookies, there was not a lot of anxiety to be had. If Berengar was going to enjoy luxuries while his soldiers were defending the borders, then he sure as hell was going to make sure his troops maintained some degree of luxury as well. Thus cookies, biscuits, tea, and other luxury items were shipped to his troops at the border to enjoy themselves with while they weren't in battle. There was no army in the world aside from Berengar's who could so thoroughly enjoy a siege in such a manner. Of course, due to the constant letters Berengar had written to Adela, she was thoroughly informed of such matters, and as such, she was well prepared for such an attack by Ava. You really are lacking in intelligence. Berengar may be in Kufstein, but his armies are well supplied and even have luxuries such as properly constructed tenements for shelter, cookies, biscuits, tea, as well as meat and eggs for meals. The only reason Berengar himself is not present on the front lines of defense is that it would serve no purpose. His armies are fully capable of defending his borders without him, and he makes sure they enjoy a similar level of luxury as himself while they are doing so. Being thoroughly defeated in the current war for words, Ava was once more showing an ugly expression. She could not confirm nor deny whether or not Adela was telling the truth, and as such, she was quite perturbed by this. Just how exactly did Adela know so much more about the situation in Tyrol than she did? Ava honestly did not believe that Berengar cared so much for Adela that he would constantly write to her informing her of his progress and daily life. I mean, after all the man had taken a lover to enjoy his time with while Adela was stuck in Graz, just how much could he care for the girl? Nevertheless, Ava recovered from her poor attitude and once more began to sling mud in Berengar's direction. If he has such an easy time defending his borders, then why does he not send his field armies into Salzburg to liberate the region and end the people's suffering? Ava had a smug smile on her face as she asked this question, believing she had caught Adela in a corner. Nevertheless, she did not expect Adela to respond in the manner in which she did. The young adolescent girl smiled with a look of pity on her face for Ava. Clearly, the woman had nothing but boobs for brains. The answer to this question was so obvious Adela felt embarrassed to point it out to her older sister. Nevertheless, Adela masterfully executed her retort by looking at Ava as if she were a simpleton before stating the reason. Because Salzburg is not Berengar's responsibility, it is your husband's. The moment Ava heard those words, she felt as if her mind had imploded. Despite just a few moments ago believing she had cornered her little sister in this little argument they were having, Adela had so masterfully evaded her vicious strike and dealt a deathly verbal blow of her own. Realizing that she had been defeated, Ava had a hard time controlling her emotions. With every fiber of her being, she wanted to claw Adela's cute doll-like face off. Yet, she resisted the temptation to do so and instead snorted before walking away from her little sister. Ava absolutely refused to engage in this little debate any further. Adela, on the other hand, was entirely satisfied with the result of this entirely meaningless debate. She had once more beaten her eldest sister in a war for words, and though this may seem pointless to logical and rational individuals such as men, to a young woman such as herself, this was a great moral victory. Chapter 170 The Progress of Civilization. Weeks had passed since the Bavarians first invaded Austria, and though their advance into Tyrol was halted at its borders, the war continued to spread to the rest of Austria. From Salzburg to Kärnten, and even into Upper and Lower Austria, the fires of war consumed the Duchy of Austria. At the moment, only Tyrol and its western neighbor Vorarlberg were primarily left untouched by the conflict. The only reason Vorarlberg had not fallen yet was because Berengar had sent troops to their aid. He could not allow himself to be cut off from the rest of the world, and as such, had spent some effort repelling Bavarian troops from Vorarlberg. Tyrol was utterly cut off from the eastern half of Austria. If Berengar wanted to aid the Count of Steiermark, his uncle and ally, his army would need to advance through Bavarian-occupied territory. It would indeed be a difficult task, but Berengar would have no choice but to do so if the city of Graz were indeed in danger. After all, he would never allow harm to come to Adela. There was an even more significant concern that had reached Berengar's attention. The Bavarians had largely isolated Tyrol. Because of that, Berengar could only trade with his partners in Italy and, by extension, the trade routes from the Italian peninsula into the Near East. As far as his German trade routes were concerned, they were utterly blocked by the Bavarian invasion of Austria. While Berengar was still making a significant profit from his trade with Italy and the Byzantine Empire, many of his customers no longer had access to his products. As such, he saw his earnings decrease significantly. At the moment, the young count was thinking of establishing trade with the remainder of Germany. Spread out in front of him was a large map of Europe. If Berengar wished to continue supplying the other German regions with steel and textiles, then he needed to maintain security in Tyrol and the county of Vorarlberg, which sat on his western border. After observing the map for some time, Berengar realized the only way to re-establish trade with northern Germany was to bring his supplies westward through Vorarlberg and the Swiss Confederacy, where they would travel north into Württemberg. From there, his products could once more spread across Germany. Due to the ongoing conflict within the German-speaking regions, Berengar would need to safeguard his trade caravans with armed forces. After coming up with this new trade route, Berengar set the task into motion and dispatched his orders to the necessary units who would conduct the trade operation. Now that he had concluded that job, he sat back in his soft leather chair within his study and sighed heavily before taking a sip from the wine contained in his skull chalice. Shortly after that, Berengar heard a knock on his door, and he immediately responded. "Come in." With that, the large wooden door creaked open to reveal Linda's beautiful figure, who was holding the baby Hans in her arms. The tiny red gold-haired infant had a curious expression on his face as he peered at his father with his deep sapphire eyes. Lind had been spending time with Hans whenever she had the opportunity. She was quite the doting mother. After Lind approached Berengar with their son in her arms, she began to speak to Berengar with a severe expression. She was here for business, and for whatever reason, had brought their infant child with her. The heavenly beauty quickly got to the point as she relayed the information she had received from Berengar's spy network. The Bavarians will be assaulting Vienna soon. The city will not be able to hold out for long. Judging by Duke Dietger's fearsome reputation, he will eliminate any potential rivals to his authority over Austria, which means that the late Duke Wilmar's children will most likely be executed after the Bavarians have taken the city. Berengar contemplated Linda's words as he stared at her with his one good eye. Obviously, Lind did not just come here to inform him of this matter, and knowing his lover well enough, Berengar assumed she had come up with a plan to benefit the two of them. As such, he asked about it. "So, what is your plan?" A pretty smile spread across Linda's immaculate visage as she heard Berengar's words. The man honestly did know her too well. As such, she quickly got to the point. "We have agents in the castle of Vienna who are currently on standby. When the castle falls, we will take advantage of the chaos to smuggle Duke Wilmar's youngest son, Conrad, out and into Kufstein, where we will then coerce him into naming you regent and creating a government in exile where you can begin a reconquest of Austria after your forces are fully prepared." Berengar was shocked by the plan Lind had presented him. It was unexpected and brilliant. Berengar had initially planned to sit back and gain Tyrol's independence through the conflict before invading Austria at a later date to claim the title of duke for himself, but this was an even better plan for his ascension to power. Of course, there was only one question on his mind about the whole situation, which he was quick to inquire about. "After we have retaken Austria, and I am declared regent, what do we do with Conrad?" A wicked grin spread across Linda's lips as she had already thought about this plan and had prepared accordingly. "We let the boy act as a puppet for a few years while we solidify our gains, and then we begin poisoning him in small doses until he becomes gravely ill and passes from this world, leaving you the regent of Austria with full authority to assume the mantle of duke." Hearing Linda's devious plot brought tingles to Berengar's spine as an equally sinister smile spreads across his face. This was a vastly superior plan than the one he had come up with and was far more likely to quell any potential rebellion against his rule. After all, with this, he gained some form of legitimacy to his claim of the title Duke of Austria when he finally succeeded. Indeed, Linda's mind was far better at scheming than Berengar's, which was one of the reasons she was such an effective spymaster. After hearing her devious plot, Berengar got up from his seat and embraced his lover and child before whispering in Linda's ear. "You are a devious little vixen, did you know that?" After hearing Berengar's words, Lind began to blush. Those words were not intended as an insult but a compliment, and she was well aware of that fact. Having said those words, Berengar let go of Lind and walked away with his hands clasped behind his back. "I approve of your plan. Make sure preparations are in place to evacuate Conrad the moment the opportunity presents itself." Lind obediently nodded before departing with Hans in hand. "Of course, master, I will not fail you." Berengar smiled and sat down after Lind had left his study. He proceeded to pull out a flagon of wine and top off his skull chalice before taking a sip from it and staring out his window. Opportunities presented themselves when one least expected them. With Linda's plot, he would be able to secure the position of Duke of Austria more efficiently, and though it might be a few years before he had the title, in practicality, it would only be a few months before he held the power of the position. Despite the ruthless plan to seize power, Berengar did feel pity for Conrad. Soon the boy would be the last living member of a powerful dynasty from his previous life, and he would not live long enough to continue said dynasty. It could be said that Berengar's interference in this world's timeline had brought the end of the Habsburg dynasty before it even reached the zenith of its power. However, he was not deeply concerned about such a thing. After all, the Habsburgs in this world would become nothing more than a stepping stone on his own dynasty's rise to power. With Lind busy preparing for this grand scheme of hers, Berengar himself realized that he could no longer sit idly by. As such, he quickly began drafting orders for further conscription. By the time the Bavarians had conquered most of Austria, Berengar would need a much larger force to deal with them. Luckily, it would take months before Austria finally yielded to Bavarian occupation, and that gave Berengar enough time to train another division. Luckily for him, the population to provide such a large number of troops was not much of an issue. With the increase in refugees coming to Tyrol and the size of the native population, Berengar had more than enough men to draft into service, something which could only be achieved because of his agricultural reforms. Without such reforms, most men would have to be in the fields to produce food, yet now they could be drafted and trained to be soldiers. Such was the progress of civilization. Chapter 171. We could just surrender. While Lind was setting her plans into motion, Berengar had begun another round of conscription. With the time it took to train recruits, he could have another division when Austria finally fell to the Bavarians. The army of Tyrol was a well-oiled machine at this point, with a large batch of veterans acting as non-commissioned and commissioned officers. Their experience from Berengar's previous campaigns allowed them to maintain control of the many new conscripts who formed the majority of the new units which were appearing. Infantry and artillery had been prioritized in recruitment. As for the cuirassiers and other forms of cavalry such as the lancers in which Berengar was fostering, they were costly to train and maintain, and as such had taken a backseat. By now, 3/4 of all of Berengar's forces were equipped with the 1417 18th rifled musket, allowing a massive range advantage on the battlefield and during sieges alike. Because of this, Berengar had decreed the 1417 land pattern musket, which was smoothbore, to be halted in production, and the existing muskets were to be converted into rifled muskets. When Berengar finally marched to war in an attempt to reclaim Austria, all his troops would be equipped with rifled muskets. Aside from line infantry, units of grenadier were fostered by the more talented conscripts and were utilized as shock troops. Berengar had also begun forming Jaeger companies comprised of lightly armored soldiers with special rifles designed for long-distance shooting. These rifles were based on the Whitworth rifle from the American Civil War during Berengar's past life. The primary difference is that they utilized a flintlock system instead of a percussion cap system. These precision rifles employed specials hexagonal bullets in a .451 caliber and were capable of an effective range from 800 to 1,000 yards. The Jaeger companies would be used as marksmen on the battlefield and would precisely execute high-profile targets, such as enemy commanders. These Jaeger units were dressed in green and black Landsknecht clothing and wore very little in terms of armor. After all, they were engaging targets at such a distance they seldom needed the protection afforded by armor. The Jaeger recruits were handpicked from the most capable shooters and trained explicitly in marksmanship. They would indeed have a fearsome reputation on the battlefield when they were finally deployed. While Berengar's forces improved in size and strength, the battle at the borders of Tyrol was still ongoing. Reinforcements had arrived to Count Siegmund's forces, and he was now forced once more to march on the walls of the Star Fortress. His medieval soldiers boldly held onto their weapons as they charged at the walls of the mighty fort in front of them. Trepidation filled every step, as those who had been present to witness the bloody spectacle of the last charge were all too aware of what awaited them. Nevertheless, the men were pushed forward towards the steel-reinforced concrete walls in which the Tyrolean forces were garrisoned. After advancing towards their objective, the thunder of the cannons mounted on the walls began to echo in the air, and the explosive shells rained down upon the invaders who prayed for their survival. However, if God truly existed, he was far from merciful. After the first barrage of cannon shells landed into the enemy's formation, they exploded upon impact and sent shrapnel in all directions. The blast itself was deadly. However, the shrapnel caused absolute carnage, which tore its way through the gaps in the Bavarian soldiers' armor and wreaked havoc across the battlefield. This was only the first volley, as such the cannons were rapidly reloaded before being fired once more. Meanwhile, the defenders of the garrison began firing their rifled muskets at the enemy when they appeared within range. The large .58 caliber lead bullets tore through the brigandine and plate armor of the attackers, rendering their defensive equipment practically useless. Blood spilled with every successful hit, and bodies fell to the floor. Despite this, the Bavarians continued to advance, hoping to get to the fortress and raise their ladders. Yet such a thing never occurred, as they were quickly torn to shreds by the defenders' mighty weapons. It did not take long before the survivors began to rout back to their siege camp once more. Despite the reinforcements received from the Duke, Count Siegmund's army had once more failed to reach the sturdy walls of the Star Fortress. Filled with fury from the recent defeat, the Count began to curse to himself as he witnessed the bloody spectacle unfold. "I can't even build a goddamn trebuchet without it being blasted to shreds by those wretched cannons. How the hell am I supposed to take this fortress?" The commanders of his army were circled around him, and every one of them could feel the Count's pain. Duke Dietger of Bavaria had ordered the man to invade Tyrol from the northwest, and despite his best efforts, he could not even get close to the fortress which blocked his path. Every time he attempted to do so, his men would be torn asunder by the powerful weapons in which the defenders possessed. It was not simply a matter of explosive power but the exceptional range in which the defenders held. Archers and crossbowmen did not stand a chance to get a shot off before getting gunned down by the rifled muskets. Due to the range of the cannons, Count Siegmund could not advance siege weapons into a position without them getting torn apart by the guns above. Trying to invade Tyrol was a nightmare for Count Siegmund, especially since he was morally against the idea to begin with. Was this God's punishment for daring to march on the center of the Reformation? This was a question Count Siegmund had asked himself many times since he first arrived at the Tyrolean border. Nevertheless, Duke Dietger would not accept failure. The rest of Austria had been invaded, so why were he and the other commander who took a position in the northeast having such a hard time advancing into Tyrol? No matter how Siegmund tried to inform Dietger of Berengar's weapons, it was of no use. One would have to personally witness their destructive power to believe their effects, for they were something that had never been seen before in this feudal world. Eventually, one of Siegmund's commanders voiced a suggestion on how to proceed. "Why don't we just wait for Duke Dietger to conquer the rest of Austria before we attempt to attack again? Morale is shaking, and there is no point sending more men to the slaughter. Before long, we will have a mutiny on our hands. It is simply impossible to enter through Tyrol through the borders of Bavaria." What the man said was the most reasonable course of action for the Bavarians at the Tyrolean border. Any further attacks would be a waste of lives. Since they could not enter through the border with Bavaria, they would have to wait for Dietger to march on Tyrol from Salzburg, which could only happen after the eastern portion of Austria was taken. Of course, Siegmund was fearful that if he took this approach, his liege would punish him severely for his cowardice. As such, he was hesitant to adopt such a strategy. Thus, he tried to encourage possible alternatives from his commanders. "Is there any other ideas on how to break through this fortress that has blocked our path?" After a few moments of silence, one of the other commanders decided to voice his idea, despite knowing it would probably be rejected. "We could just surrender." The moment he said this, all eyes stared at him as if he were an imbecile. As such, he quickly coughed before explaining himself further. There are probably less than 500 men in that garrison, and Berengar has these forts all over the border, assuming his entire army is equipped with such terrifying weapons. Do we really believe Duke Dietger can win this war? Is it not better to surrender to Berengar's armies now and be treated with dignity? I hear he is quite merciful to those who surrender willingly. After explaining himself thoroughly, the other commanders present began to take his idea as a realistic suggestion. They had already lost thousands of men in their multiple attempts at the wall without injuring any of the defenders. Even in a field battle, the weapons the Tyroleans used would be disastrous to fight against. Maybe the man had a point? After a heated debate, Siegmund had finally come to a decision. He would no longer waste the lives of his men trying to invade Tyrol. It was a pointless endeavor, but he also would not surrender to Berengar until he knew who would win the war. As such, he gave his commands. We will sit back and do nothing until we can see who a clear winner of this war is. If Dietger's armies begin to pressure Berengar's, we will launch another offensive. If they are soundly defeated, we will surrender to Berengar. Does anyone disagree with this approach? After having a vote, the result was unanimous. The army at the northwest border of Tyrol would no longer actively engage in this conflict, giving Berengar and his forces some reprieve. Chapter 172 Fields of Steiermark. In the fields of Steiermark, near the border of Salzburg, two armies had met. On the side of the Austrians, Count Otto was facing off against the Bavarians who had the gall to enter his lands. Though the nearby regions were set ablaze from the ongoing invasion, Steiermark had been one of the few counties capable of defending itself for the time being. The reason for this was simple. Count Otto and his armies escaped from the fields of Passau primarily intact, and as such, he had the most significant remaining professional force within the entirety of Austria. Outside of Berengar's army, that is. As such, the man was able to competently defend his territory, though that did not stop the Bavarians from trying to force him into submission. While the battle waged, Count Otto found himself dismounted and engaging with the enemy forces in melee combat. While he did so, a few bolts flew past the Count's face, which was covered in a great bassinet. One of these bolts even directly collided with his throat plate. However, it was effortlessly deflected by the sturdy steel helmet. Like most of his army's equipment, the armor Count Otto was equipped had been provided by the man's nephew. Berengar had not cut corners when creating Count Otto's plate armor, and though it was not as advanced as the designs of full plate armor in which Berengar had access, it was made with the finest materials and by the greatest craftsmen of his realm. As such, Count Otto was adequately protected against the enemy's missile fire. After his armor deflected the oncoming bolts with ease, Count Otto found himself engaging in a sword fight with a relatively well-equipped man-at-arms. Wielding his longsword with excellent skill, Otto quickly disarmed the enemy opponent before gripping the blade of his sword in a technique that is referred to as half-swording, where he drove the tip of the blade into the gaps in the enemy's armor. The opponent grunted in pain as his shoulder was pierced, and Otto followed up with a murder stroke, smashing the pommel of his sword against the opponent's helmet, acting as a makeshift mace. After a few mighty swings, the enemy collapsed, his skull thoroughly crushed by Otto's onslaught. After ending his opponent's miserable existence, Otto gazed upon the battlefield and noticed that the tide had begun to turn in his favor. Though the Bavarians were more significant in number, Otto was an experienced commander and easily outmaneuvered the hostile army. While he was engaging the enemy forces as the commander of the vanguard, his cavalry, which was led by one of his vassals, had passed beyond the enemy's flanks and smashed into them with their lances like an unstoppable tidal wave. In doing so, the cavalry broke the enemy formation and forced them to regroup. This was the strategy Duke Wilmar had attempted to use at Passau. However, this time, it worked as intended, mainly because the Bavarians were not prepared for another feigned retreat. With their flanks smashed and the survivors beginning to rout, the enemy lines quickly began to crumble. Noticing that the battle had begun to shift in his favor, Otto continued his onslaught of the men in front of him with fierce determination. Surrounded by a group of disarmed knights, the courageous count charged towards the enemy like an enraged tiger. Not all men-at-arms of the Bavarian army were equipped head to toe in brigandine and plate, and as such, the sword was still quite the effective weapon. With great finesse, Otto swiftly dodged an oncoming strike before lunging with his blade into the enemy's thigh, piercing through the femoral artery and causing the man to bleed out on the spot in rapid fashion. However, the count did not have time to breathe as he was quickly rushed by another enemy, who immediately bound Otto's sword with his own. As the two were caught in a struggle, an oncoming lancer pierced through the backplate of the enemy, aiding Otto in his conflict. Sweat began to pool on Otto's forehead as he continued to exert his energy in the heat of battle. The Bavarian forces started to retreat after a while. Even though the enemy was routing, Otto did not pursue them. He feared he would fall into a trap similar to the late Duke Wilmar. As such, the surviving Bavarians fled back into Salzburg, which was primarily occupied by the Bavarians. By winning this battle, Otto had secured the county of Steiermark for a bit longer. However, if the Bavarians kept persisting in their attempts to invade his territory, sooner or later, his armies would falter. Gazing at the losses on both sides, Otto began to lament the deaths of those brave soldiers who fought for their homeland. What he needed now was the aid of an ally. Unfortunately, most of his supporters were significantly weakened by the horrific loss at Passau and were themselves struggling to maintain their territory. The only one who was able to help the man was Berengar, and Otto did not fully trust his nephew. While Berengar had supplied Otto's forces with a great deal of equipment and resources, it became increasingly apparent that the young Count of Tyrol had no intentions to intervene in the war and merely sit it out in his well-defended territory. What was even more suspicious was that the Bavarians were all equipped with a similar level of equipment that the Austrians were using. This led Otto to believe that Berengar was supplying both sides of the conflict as a war profiteer. The fact that the only action Berengar had taken during this conflict was defending his borders and that of his western neighbor further filled Otto's doubts of his nephew's loyalty. Though Berengar seemed to care for Otto's youngest daughter Adela unless the Bavarians threatened her life, Berengar was unlikely to aid Otto, and the man knew it. However, Otto also knew that Berengar was a man driven by self-interest. If that were the case, if he wanted to acquire his nephew's help, precisely that of his armies, he would need to develop some incentive for him to do so. These were the issues Count Otto thought about as his soldiers began to clean up the battlefield. Eventually, one of the Count's commanders approached him and handed him a letter. "My liege, there is a letter for you which contains the seal of the von Habsburg dynasty." Count Otto sighed heavily as he grabbed a hold of the letter and began to read its contents. He could already guess what information the letter contained. After reading the letter, Otto tore it up and cast the shredded remains into the wind. The action, of course, shocked his commander, and the man could not help but voice his concerns. "Your Excellency, what is it?" Count Otto stared into the distance towards the direction of Vienna with a solemn expression before answering the man's question. "Vienna is under siege once more, and Wilmar's heir requests our aid." After receiving such news, the Count's actions further confused the commander, and as such, he asked the question on his mind. "And we are not providing it?" Count Otto then stared grimly into the commander's eyes before making his stance clear. "With what army? The survivors of this battle need to defend Steiermark from further incursion. We do not have the men to spare if we wish to break the siege of Vienna. I have already done enough for the Habsburgs. I need to think of my own family's safety." Though the commander was initially shocked, he also understood Otto's thoughts on the matter. This was a war Austria was now fated to lose, and the Count of Steiermark had to think about his family's future. To prevent the most losses to his territory, he would have to abandon the Habsburgs to their fate. Of course, neither of the men had any idea that by doing this, they were playing into Berengar's plot to topple the Habsburg dynasty and place himself as duke in the upcoming years. After cleaning up the battlefield and scavenging the equipment from the corpses that were buried in mass graves, the armies of Count Otto began to return to Graz, where they would rest, until a time where they were needed to defend their borders once more. Unfortunately for the von Gratz family, they were not located in the mountainous region of Tyrol. As such, they were not afforded the natural barrier in which the Alps provided Berengar. Thus they would have to meet the enemy in the field every time they presented themselves. Thus, with the battle being completed and the von Gratz family rejection of the Habsburgs' request for aid, the war in Austria began to advance towards Berengar's interests. For now, Steiermark would remain free from Bavarian influence, but whether they could endure the tides of war long enough to be a part of Berengar's resistance to Bavarian authority was yet to be determined. Chapter 173 War Council I. Berengar was currently standing in the middle of his great hall. He was posing for a painter who had shown exceptional talent over the last few months, so much so that Berengar had commissioned this painter to paint a portrait of himself. The first of many to come. It was no secret that Berengar was an incredibly vain man. He cared greatly for his appearance and those around him. There was a reason he outfitted his forces in the flashy attire of the Landsknecht from his previous life. He secretly wondered if he had inherited this from his father in this life or if he had developed it over time. After all, in his previous life, Berengar was an exceptionally average-looking man. His great attracting feature was the body he had put a lot of effort into developing into that of a warrior's. His face, however, was nothing special, and though it was not ugly, it was certainly not attractive either. However, after reincarnating into this life, he found himself in the body of an exceptionally handsome young man. If one went from average to a 10 out of 10, it made sense for them to become slightly obsessed with their appearance. At the moment, the young count stood dressed in his armor. The 3/4 plate armor was made out of blackened steel, with exquisite gold embellishments. The pauldrons were perfectly sloped over the gaps in the armor to the point where rondelles were unneeded. His gauntlets allowed access to the individual fingers, and he currently held onto the grip of his heavy cavalry sword, which was slung across his waist and sitting within its sheath. His free hand rested on his equally embellished open-face burgonet, which sat on a nearby end table. Berengar's facial expression was cold and indifferent, which went perfectly with his gilded black velvet eye patch, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The portrait itself was from the waist up, and as such, the armor which protected his thighs and groin were not visible. In the audience watching the painter display, Berengar's majestic appearance with excellent skill was Lind, who greatly admired the process. Berengar had promised that if it turned out as well as he thought it would, then he would commission one of Lind as well. As such, she was pretty excited as she saw the portrait slowly take shape. The painting was of far more excellent quality than the average medieval period painting. Berengar was far from an artist, but he knew how to explain how to use basic principles from his past life. After all, he had taken a few painting classes in high school as an elective. So he was able to help the artists in Kufstein advance their skills so that their paintings would be more lifelike. As the painting neared completion, it significantly resembled other portraits from the Renaissance period from Berengar's past life. It was quite the magnificent work, and the painter would never have acquired such skills without Berengar's instruction and the funds that the young count provided artists in Kufstein to pursue their passions. After the work was completed, the young painter showed Berengar the end product. As Berengar witnessed the creation with his own eyes, a large smile spread across his face as he handed the man a pouch filled with gold coins before complimenting the artist. "As always, your paintings never cease to amaze me. Well done, lad." It was pretty awkward for Berengar to refer to the young man as a lad. After all, he was only 21, and the artist was of a similar age to him. Nevertheless, one does not question what the count calls you, and the man merely smiled at the compliments he was given, and more importantly, the pouch he received, which was filled with gold coins. Berengar then placed his steel-clad arm around the man's back and instructed him on his next task. "Go and rest. You have earned it. Whenever you feel the tingle of creativity in the back of your mind once more, return to my castle and paint a portrait of my beautiful lover." The young man merely nodded at Berengar's request and left the room, where Lind was waiting in the background for the two men to complete their transaction. She had a lovely grin on her face as she looked at the portrait before expressing her opinion. "It looks phenomenal. Who knew art could be so beautiful?" Berengar merely chuckled as he began to strip his armor off of himself, which Lind immediately took notice of and assisted in the process. While they were in the process of taking off his equipment, Berengar voiced his opinion on the piece. "The artist was lucky that I am so handsome. If I were an average man, the piece would not be as inspiring." Lind merely rolled her eyes at the sight of Berengar complimenting himself yet again. She was well aware of his sense of vanity, still, that honestly did not make her think any less of him. After all, she was first attracted to him because of his appearance. She chuckled as she thought how foolish she was for trying to drug and enslave Berengar when they first met. Though things did not turn out as she had intended to that night, she was far happier with the actual result. Thinking about their first night together made Lind incredibly aroused, and after she finished stripping off Berengar's armor, she pressed her ample breasts into her lover's chest in an attempt to seduce him. Noticing Linda's longing gaze, Berengar chuckled. He had no idea what she was thinking about to bring on this sudden change, but she was seriously too tempting. It was no wonder he fell for her charms when they first met. Nevertheless, he was much too busy to satisfy her at the moment. The portrait was just one of his many responsibilities on his daily list. Before he could fool around with his lover, he had to take care of the realm. As such, he flicked the girl on the nose as she tried to seduce him with her beautiful figure. Be patient. I am swamped with work at the moment. However, I promise I will satisfy you later tonight. Lind began to pout when Berengar rejected her, but she knew that he always kept his word, and as such, she put on a sultry smile as she kissed him passionately. It was only after she released herself did she say the comments on her mind. I will hold you to that promise. Afterward, Lind fled from Berengar's sight, leaving him behind in the room by himself. Berengar merely licked his lips as he said to himself aloud, I am going to make her pay for that. Now that his portrait was finished, Berengar had plenty of other matters to attend to. So did Lind. As the master of Berengar's spy network, she quickly got to work compiling information on Berengar's enemies, expanding the web that covered southern Germany. Soon enough, Berengar's agents would be in every corner of the Holy Roman Empire, collecting information and waiting for an opportunity to strike. As for Berengar, he had a meeting to attend to, where he would be consulting with several officers in his army about the ongoing war in Austria. Though now was not the time to strike, preparations were in progress for the critical moment when Vienna fell, and Conrad was extracted to Kufstein where he could set up an Austrian government in exile. If even one cog in the machine that was his army failed to fulfill its duty, Berengar could lose everything in this upcoming ploy. With this in mind, Berengar got changed into his civilian clothing and visited the building constructed to act as the headquarters of his Department of Defense. When he arrived in the war room, Berengar noticed that several officers were waiting for him inside it, and they quickly jumped into salutes as Berengar made his presence known. Berengar, of course, returned the salutes before giving the command. At ease, where the officers slightly relaxed their position. Afterward, Berengar and the officers in the war room sat down in the chairs that were provided for them, where Berengar began to start the meeting. First and foremost, how are the 2,500 troops I sent to Vorarlberg doing? One of the officers who bore the rank of general quickly announced the status of the operation to defend the western borders of Austria. Your Excellency, the Count of Vorarlberg, is grateful for the troops we have sent, and under the command of the officer in charge, they have done an excellent job in repelling the advance of the Bavarians. By now, the Bavarian army which attacked the region has been completely pushed out, largely in part to our forces. However, the Count of Vorarlberg and his armies should also be commended for their success. Berengar nodded in approval at this news before addressing his next concern. So the region has been secured for our trade caravans to pass through? The general quickly responded in the affirmative. That is correct, Your Excellency. S. Berengar smiled when he heard those words. Now that the Western Front was secure, Berengar did not have to worry about fighting on two sides when he finally got involved in the war for Austria. As such, he began to address the border crisis. How about the border forts? How are they holding up? Another man bearing the rank of colonel quickly informed Berengar about the ongoing conflict at the border as he spread a map across the table and placed a few minifigures that represented the forces involved in the battle. The northwest garrison has completely halted the advance of the Bavarians. After trying to attack numerous forts, they have given up completely and are simply maintaining their presence at the border. As for the northeast border, the Bavarians are still concentrating their efforts to break through the defense. However, they are making no progress due to the construction of the star forts in the area and how well defended they are. The enemy army usually routes after a few artillery barrages. We have yet to suffer a single casualty, well aside from some minor wounds. Berengar smiled and nodded at this news. Ultimately, for the time being, Tyrol was secure. As such, Berengar decided to inform his officers of his upcoming plans, for they could not adequately prepare themselves if they were unaware. As such, Berengar deeply thought about the words he would use next, as they were of critical importance to his future plans. Thus the officers in the war room were left in silence as they waited for their liege and commander to give his passionate speech on the future of the war in Austria, one which would one day be recorded in history as a symbol of Berengar's rise to power. Chapter 174 War Council 2. The silence permeated throughout the stale air of the war room for some time before Berengar finally voiced his concerns over the upcoming period with an impassioned speech. Gentlemen, we are at the dawn of a new era. The invasion from the Bavarians has brought us an unforeseen opportunity. Vienna is under siege, and the Habsburg dynasty is nearing its end. If we take advantage of this upheaval to rescue the youngest member of the dynasty from the predicament he finds himself in, we will be able to benefit from this crisis and establish a government in exile, with our county at the center of the resistance. Imagine a new Austria with Tyrol at the core of its power. For this vision of the future to become a reality, I need every one of you to seize this opportunity that lies before us. For a greater Austria, every man within the war room of the headquarters of the Department of Defense was an ambitious man, at least to the point that they were eager to follow Berengar in his future conquests. Not a single one of them were displeased with this plan that would allow their liege to usurp the Duchy of Austria in the future. As such, when Berengar finished his speech, it was met with the battle cry of the Tyrolean army from all of the officers present. God with us. Seeing the officers pound their chests in a unified salute and scream the battle cry of his army, Berengar was pleased. It would appear that the core of his officers had taken his side in the upcoming conflict. Though Berengar did not doubt their loyalty, he was an exceptionally cautious man and had to prepare for the event that he would be betrayed. As such, he was closely examining every member of his staff before nodded his head in approval. After witnessing the scene of his officers come to terms with his plan, Berengar pointed towards Vienna on the map before sharing his and Linda's plan with the high-ranking officers who made up the core of his military hierarchy. Our agents have long since infiltrated Vienna's castle. When the city falls and the castle with it, we predict that Duke Dietger of Bavaria will butcher any potential rivals to his claim over Bavaria, and as such we will smuggle Conrad out of the castle of Vienna, where we will coerce him into making myself regent, while we work towards restoring the Habsburg dynasty to power over Austria. In name only, of course, the real power behind the throne will be me as regent, and by extension all of you as officers in my army. You all do not need to worry about this operation's success, as it is left to the Department of Intelligence. As for your jobs, it will be to ensure that our forces are prepared and amassed at our eastern border for the three-prong invasion through Salzburg, Kärnten, and Upper Austria. After we have seized those regions, we will rally with the forces of Steiermark and march on the Bavarians in Lower Austria, which will allow us to seize Vienna and declare our war a victory. Hearing Berengar's plan for invading Eastern Austria and reclaiming it, the officers were all impressed. By the time they were able to invade Bavarian-occupied Austria, they would have roughly 30,000 men. They would be able to split their army into 3 divisions of 10,000 men each to advance on the 3 locations. Each division would have enough firepower to successfully defeat any army they might come across. The strategy itself was planned by Berengar. Considering Eckhard was currently overseeing the forces stationed in Kitzbühel, the young count had to design the operation entirely by himself, and as an avid strategy gamer from his past life, he was more than capable of devising an invasion plan such as this. The officers comprised of the core of his military hierarchy all agreed with the strategy, and though a few of them added some minor inputs, the invasion plan was mainly complete. As such, after a thorough discussion, the officers were eventually dismissed, and Berengar found himself alone in the war rooms staring at the map. One day soon, Austria would be his, and his plans for unifying Germany into a greater German empire would be one step closer to reality. After looking over his battle plans one more time, Berengar rolled up the map and stashed it away, where he then left the headquarters of the Department of Defense and returned to his castle, where Lind and Henrietta were waiting patiently for him to attend dinner. The moment Berengar sat down at the head of the table, he overheard Linda's feminine voice call out to him. "So, how did the War Council go?" Upon hearing these words, Berengar smirked, before tussling Linda's silky red gold hair. Afterward, he took a sip out of the Doppelbock beer, filled in his skull chalice before responding. "You do not need to worry so much, everything is going according to the plan. Soon enough, we will rule this land." Henrietta, of course, had no idea what the young couple was conspiring about this time, nor did she care. Instead, she spoke up voluntarily for the first time in a while with a broad smile on her face. "I made a friend today." Hearing Henrietta openly declare such a thing brought a great sense of surprise to both Berengar and Lind, who had not expected her to make a friend so quickly after they had given her advice. They thought it would take a while before Henrietta would leave her comfort zone and approach the other girls in her class. As such, Berengar immediately took a sip from his chalice before replying to Henrietta. "I am glad to hear it, so who is this little friend of yours?" Henrietta was all too eager to announce her friend's name and how they met. As such, she quickly began to spit out the events of what happened as rapidly as machine gunfire. Not that such a thing existed in this world. Her name is Charlotte, and she is the daughter of one of the soldiers in your army. We met at lunch when I overheard her talking about how her father always brags about your victories in battle and how he was a part of them. So I told her you were not always the bold commander you are today and how you used to be a sickly, foolish boy. She was eager to hear about your past, so we talked throughout the lunch period about how you used to be and how you change. Berengar nearly choked on his beer when he overheard Henrietta informing her friends of his embarrassing past, Lind. On the other hand, she was smirking at Berengar's misfortune and began to encourage Henrietta to continue with her behavior. That's good, Henrietta. I remember when I first heard of your brother years ago, the rumors that were flowing about then was that he would not live to be 20, and he spent most of his days idling about and throwing childish tantrums every time something did not go his way. Berengar glared at Lind when she reminded him of the original host of his current body. Every time he looked back on those memories, he began to cringe at the old Berengar's immature behavior and dull mindset. If he had not reincarnated in this body, that fool would have ended up dying anyway, and Berengar would never be able to achieve anything significant in life. Luckily for him, he was able to reinvent his image through many difficulties, that is. As such, the younger generation was utterly unaware of his original reputation, despite it roughly being a year since his massive change in behavior. After listening to the two girls criticize his past, Berengar coughed a little before addressing Henrietta's conversation about him with her friend Charlotte. Henrietta, my dear sister. Henrietta perked up her head like a bit of meerkat when she heard Berengar address her in such a manner. Yes? Berengar took another sip from his beer before finishing his train of thought. The whole scenario vexed him. If you love me as your brother, you will do best not to remind people of my embarrassing past. Lind chuckled as she witnessed Berengar's pained expression. As for Henrietta, she was confused. After all, Berengar was the one who encouraged her to talk about information most people did not know about him to the other girls in an attempt to make friends. However, she quickly realized she might have wounded Berengar's pride as the Count of Tyrol and began to pout before nodding her head in agreement. Okay. I will only say the good things about your past from now on. Seeing that Henrietta had agreed to his request, Berengar smiled gratefully before reaching across the table and patting Henrietta's little head while praising her. Good girl. This action, of course, brought a gentle smile to Henrietta's face as she basked in the affection of her dearest older brother. Lind, of course, would not miss the opportunity to make fun of Berengar and quickly muttered under her breath. Lolicon? This statement instantly disrupted Berengar's actions and brought a frown to his face. As such, he withdrew his hand from Henrietta's glossy golden blonde hair before awkwardly digging into his meal. After which Henrietta began to pout at Lind for disrupting her moment. The meal continued in awkward silence as the trio enjoyed the gourmet cuisine made for them by the talented chefs of Berengar's castle. Chapter 175 A Normal Day for the Count of Tyrol. After dining with Lind and Henrietta, Berengar was finally able to relax. As such he sat in front of the fireplace as the evening came and went. Drinking wine from his skull chalice, the more he drank, the more intoxicated he became until finally, he started speaking to his goblet as if he were speaking to his brother himself. Lambert, my little brother, why do you hate me to such a degree that you must attempt to end my life and usurp my title? Though Berengar had roughly heard about the reason for Lambert's actions during their duel at Obserdoft and could slightly sympathize with him, after all, if he was in the boy's position and had an older brother like Berengar from before his reincarnation, he too would have plotted against such a fool. Yet to Berengar, Lambert's actions were unforgivable, mainly because he continued to engage in such behavior after Berengar had proven himself capable of leading the house to greater power and prosperity. Obviously, the chalice made from Lambert's skull did not reply to Berengar's question. Meanwhile, Lind had walked in and observed Berengar's drunken conversation with the inanimate object, and as such, she quickly approached him and grabbed the chalice from his hands as he attempted to take another swig. I think you have had enough, master? Gazing at Linda's worried expression and the look in which the skull chalice was giving him, Berengar merely chuckled before allowing Lind to snatch his goblet away from his grasp. The young count voiced his support for his lover's actions as he struggled to get to his feet while leaning on Lind for support. You are probably right. After finding his balance, Berengar slowly followed Lind to their room, where she helped him get undressed and into bed. Shortly thereafter she followed suit. Berengar was too drunk to fulfill his promise earlier in the day, and because of that, the young beauty pouted. Nevertheless, she found comfort in the act of cuddling in the arms of her lover as the two drifted to sleep. Before long the light of dawn shone through the window, and Berengar awoke from his drunken stupor. Miraculously he did not have a hangover, which he was thankful to Dionysus for such a result. He commonly found himself thanking the old pagan gods whenever something good happened to him related to their mastery. It was a light-hearted joke, and obviously something he kept to himself. As an atheist, he did not truly believe in his jests. However, when he gazed at the unsatisfied expression on Linda's sleeping face, he realized that he had failed to fulfill his promise. As such a wicked smile appeared on his face as a sinister plot formed in his mind. However, before he could begin to enact such a thing, Berengar heard the infant cries of Hans in the other room, and Linda's maternal instincts took over with her sky-blue eyes instantly opening and her head is rising from her pillow. Seeing her bare body glistening in the light of dawn, Berengar wanted to pounce on the mother of his child then and there. Still, unfortunately for him, she was too focused on their son and his cries as such. She quickly got out of bed and dressed in her nightgown before leaving Berengar to pout like a child who had just been denied his favorite toy. Seeing that he no longer had the opportunity to fool around with Lind this morning, Berengar too got out of bed and dressed in his loose-fitting athletic attire before beginning his daily routine. After doing his morning run, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, and pull-ups, Berengar began lifting weights before training in swordsmanship. Now that his right eye was no longer usable, his combat prowess was greatly diminished, especially since he had been forced to retrain himself in using his offhand. After all, without the use of his dominant eye, to oversee the use of his dominant hand, fighting with his right hand was merely asking for trouble. As such, he was once more thoroughly thrashed in his sparring session with one of the knights under his command. However, Berengar was a persistent man, and he would not give up until he was once more adequate in using the sword. However, he would not be leading any charges on the battlefield until then and would merely stay at the rear and allow his soldiers to fight for him. The idea of which greatly wounded his pride as he thought about it. Nevertheless, that was the price to pay for his arrogance. As such, he spent his bath time greatly reflecting on the foolish actions of his past, the results of which were brought upon by his growing ego. After getting out of his bath and fulfilling his other basic hygiene requirements, Berengar ate breakfast with his family. Ultimately the meal was uneventful, and nothing of importance was discussed. As such, Berengar soon found himself thrust into his work where he mainly oversaw the approval of budget concerns enacted by the House of Lords. Now that he had capable and loyal men leading the charge in his reforms, Berengar had little to micromanage and thus had a much larger degree of spare time than he had in the past when he had to lead the efforts in every small thing. Eventually, a peculiar file found its way to his desk, which was for the approval of the appointment of a member of the House of Lords, a man with which Berengar had spent much time in the past, but lately had left to his own devices. Gunther, the reputable farmer who had helped him implement his agricultural reforms in their early stages, was voted into the House of Commons by the standard population capable of voting, which was still very few at this point in time. He had greatly embraced education and spent a significant degree of his spare time educating himself on various topics. Seeing that he passed the test that was established to determine one's ability to vote and the other exam that determined one's ability to hold a position of political office, Berengar had no complaints in approving his appointment. During one of the previous amendments to the Constitution of Tyrol, Berengar had amended his constitutional powers to allow the ability to accept a nominee onto the House of Lords and the House of Commons to reside with the head of state. Even though the ordinary people and the lords could vote on their representatives, assuming that they had passed the minimum standard of education to do so, and the other constitutional requirements, it was still not a guarantee that elected person would fulfill the position. Ultimately the power to choose who represented the people still rested with Berengar. For example, he would never approve someone into a position of power who was antagonistic to his and his family's interests. Nor would he support someone with a track record of sheer incompetency or corruption. Sometimes the people did not know what was best for society, and it was at that point a monarch must step in to prevent the foolishness of said people from harming the nation. However, Berengar had no complaints with Gunther. The man was quite intelligent for someone born into the position of a serf. He had also proven his competency in the initial stages of Berengar's agricultural reforms. Now that he was fairly educated, he was the perfect representative for the common people. As such, Berengar quickly signed his approval to the document before moving on to the next candidate. After getting through a list of potential candidates to fill the vacant seats in both parliamentary branches, Berengar had rejected over 75% of them, mainly due to the lack of ability they had demonstrated in their respective fields. As such, the parliamentary system was still largely unfilled. Yet, it was beginning to take shape, and as such, Berengar's workload thoroughly decreased with each passing day. Still, Berengar had plenty of documents to read through and sign, and as such, he spent the rest of his day doing such a thing. By the time he had finished with his day's work, it was well past the dinner hour. He had once more missed the occasion to dine with his family. Nevertheless, Berengar quickly got up from his seat, in which he had been sitting in all day for the most part, and headed to the kitchen for a meal, where he dined by his lonesome before returning to his room. Much to his surprise, Lind was waiting for him, completely naked and lying on his bed with a lustful smile on her face while showing off her alluring figure. Berengar quickly shut the door behind him as he entered the room, and Lind beckoned for him to join her as she stated the words, "It is time to fulfill your promise." An eager smile appeared on Berengar's face as he stripped out of his luxurious clothing and pounced on his lover. He had been waiting for this all day. The couple spent the rest of their waking hours making love, where Berengar was exceptionally careful not to get her pregnant. After all, they already had one child, and Lind was still young, with many years of fertility to come. It was best not to rush such things. With this, Berengar endured a typical day in his routine as the Count of Tyrol. Chapter 176 Selling Armor to the Byzantines. While Berengar's armies were maintaining the situation at the border, Berengar himself was able to thoroughly enjoy the peaceful nature brought about by the stability of his lands. Though several of the other lords of Tyrol in which he had subjugated in his conquests were primarily upset by the many reforms he had forced upon them, due to his careful deployment of troops in every central region, they had little power to rebel against him. Most of them, of course, was wise enough not to take such an action while the Bavarians ravaged the rest of Austria. Berengar may be a tyrant who stripped them of several of their feudal powers, but he provided a stable and economically efficient realm in a time of chaos and destruction. As such, the benefits they gained from Berengar's economic ventures outweighed the disadvantages they gained by surrendering their authority to raise their own troops. In fact, with Berengar's military reforms, creating a centralized army under his command, the individual lords of his realm were spared the expense of training and outfitting such troops. Though these soldiers who garrisoned their cities were fanatically loyal to Berengar, they had not caused any problems for the authority of his vassals, aside from reminding them to follow the laws in which Berengar had enacted. The complex imperial-style bureaucracy which Berengar had put into effect throughout Tyrol had greatly diminished the amount of time these lords needed to work on governing their realms, allowing them to maintain a lavish lifestyle filled with far more leisure than before. The younger nobility greatly appreciated Berengar's political reforms, as they had far less work to do and could enjoy themselves with their vast fortunes. The critical positions of nobility, such as viscounts and barons, was filled mainly with Berengar's generation. After all, most of their parents had taken part in Lothar's rebellion and ended up with a similar fate to the late count. At first, many of them greatly despised Berengar and blamed him for the result. However, Berengar was crafty, and he showed off the wealth generated from the industrial districts in the cities of Kufstein and Innsbruck to lure these young noblemen to his cause. If they proved their loyalty and put aside their foolish beliefs, they too could gain the approval for an industrial district in their region. Ultimately, whether or not Berengar was to blame for their parents' deaths quickly became an afterthought in the minds of many of these young noblemen when they realized the vast fortune that could be gained by following Berengar. Peace reigned over Tyrol while most of the German-speaking regions were bleeding in constant conflict. Because of this, Berengar's trade flourished internally and with his trading partners in Italy and the Byzantine Empire. At the moment, Berengar was hosting a feast for Arethas, who brought him some great news from the empire in the east. It had been several months since he last saw his most significant trading partner. As far as Berengar was aware, the man was in the process of convincing the empire to outsource a portion of their equipment to Berengar's factories. Finally, the strategos of Ionia had brought him the news in which Berengar wanted to hear. "The emperor has finally agreed to my request. We expect a third of our army's equipment to be manufactured here in Kufstein. I assume your facilities can handle such a large request?" Berengar chuckled as he drank from his skull chalice before answering the man's question. Of course, it will not be a problem. Arethes was happy to hear such a thing as he toasted his chalice of wine to Berengar and their upcoming business venture. To our collective fortune, may it be a long and fruitful relationship. Berengar lifted his goblet in the toast before drinking from it once more. The fact that Berengar was now drinking from an exquisite skull chalice and had an eye patch did not go unnoticed by the Byzantine nobleman who awkwardly brought up the subject. So, I can't help but notice the skull chalice and the eye patch. Is there something I should know about? Berengar quickly put down his knife and fork when he heard those words. His expression became stern as he closely observed the skull of his little brother, which had been turned into an extravagant drinking cup. Eventually, a sinister smile spread across his face as he told the man the truth of the matter. Someone close to me sought to do me harm. After they had made numerous attempts on my life and were exiled from my domain, they returned with an army to usurp my position. During the battle, that person took the sight from my right eye. For that I killed them and seized their skull as a trophy. I decided to turn it into a drinking cup so that I always remember that even the closest members of your friends and family can betray you, and the price that is paid for being merciful. Berengar's chilling words permeated the air and were quickly followed by silence. Lind was the only person aware of who Berengar was referring to. Henrietta was blissfully unaware that the skull chalice in which Berengar always drank from was that of her other brother. Naturally, she was not informed of Lambert's death nor his treasonous actions. As such, she assumed it was someone else. As for Arethes, he was greatly disturbed that the chalice was an actual human skull dipped in gold and not some monstrous work of art. Such barbarism was unacceptable in the empire to the east, yet the Count of Tyrol looked upon the skull chalice with a sense of pride. Such a thing was genuinely unthinkable for civilized people. Despite his inner protests, Arethes knew that his business relationship with Tyrol was worth more than his internal disgust. As such, he quietly calmed himself before responding to Berengar's tale. I see. With that said, Berengar shifted the conversation to that of business and began to inquire about the order's details. Tell me, what style of armor will I be creating for your empire's forces? Seeing that the topic was shifted from its previous grim nature, Arethes quickly addressed Berengar's question. I believe you referred to it as mirror pattern armor. As long as you can make those complex pieces, we can handle the rest of the production, such as the mail armor that goes underneath it. This was a simple enough request, and Berengar would be happy to fulfill it. Mail took longer to manufacture anyways and was hardly worth the efforts of his industry. As such, he was pleased with such news. Thus Berengar quickly addressed his next concern. Will you need us to manufacture helmets or arms? Arethes shook his head before answering. Unfortunately, all I was able to get approval for was the production of the mirror pattern breastplates and its pauldrons. As such, those are the only pieces of equipment we require you to manufacture. Berengar nodded in approval. It was much simpler to divert a production line to a single piece of equipment, and as such, he was more than happy to manufacture it. After all, it was an expensive piece of armor to produce, and doing so in massive numbers would allow him substantial profit. As such, he replied to Arethes' request in the affirmative. Fine by me, the price is negotiable, but such complex pieces will require a significant production line to be laid down for it. As such, my initial offer is 15 hyperpyrons per piece. The hyperpyron was a gold coin in use by the Byzantine Empire during its later days of Berengar's past life. In that timeline, it was gradually debased to the point of worthlessness. However, in this timeline, the Byzantine Empire was still powerful, wealthy, and largely stable. As such, the currency maintained its value of roughly 20.5 carats or 4.1 grams of gold. It was by no means a small sum, but then again, Berengar's armor would be of substantially better quality than the iron products the Byzantines currently use. Arethes' face twitched as he heard such a large number. Luckily Berengar prefaced his statement with the phrase, "The price is negotiable." As such, he began to haggle with the young count sitting before him as he dined on his schnitzel. 10 hyperpyrons. Berengar shook his head as he counter-offered. 14. The two noblemen haggled over minute details until finally, a price of 12 hyperpyrons per armor set consisting of a breastplate and pauldrons. Berengar was satisfied with the result, but Arethes was clenching his teeth. This would cost the empire a significant amount, but it would be well worth the price, and as such, he finally accepted the outcome. After the two men concluded their negotiations over the cost of the equipment, they shared a meal and continued to enjoy the peace that was afforded to the region of Tyrol. Now that Arethusa acted as the importer to Berengar's equipment within the Byzantine Empire, he gained some degree of profit. The two noblemen from very different regions of the world were now intertwined in the arms and textile trades, which acted as a huge source of income for both parties. With the business negotiations concluded, the two parties enjoyed the remainder of the meal, engaging in casual conversation about what the two had been up to over the past few months since they last met. Obviously, Berengar made sure to stay away from the topic of his battle with the Teutonic Order, as his savagery in that event seemed to cause great discomfort to the noblemen from the east. Then again, Berengar was a German, a descendant of the barbarians who sacked Rome and destroyed its empire. The idea that a Roman from the east and an intensely nationalistic German who took pride in his ancestors' accomplishments could form such an amicable relationship was entertaining to Berengar. Despite this, Berengar was aware that such a relationship was vital to his plans. Thus he tried his best not to pour salt on the grave of the Western Roman Empire. Chapter 177 School Days. At the moment Henrietta was currently in class, silently listening to the teacher explain basic arithmetic. In the classroom around her were a bunch of female students her own age. Under Berengar's public education system he had separated it by gender in order to avoid any unnecessary distractions, especially among those who might be entering their adolescent years. This way he was also able to design the curriculum in a way that catered to the ways in which boys and girls tended to study. As such, this was an all-girls school with only female instructors. The woman in charge of teaching basic mathematics was a noblewoman who had at Berengar's request filled the position. After all, there was not much for a woman of her status in life to do, and it felt good to aid in the development of the next generation. Charlotte was sitting next to Henrietta and was struggling with the basic concepts. She was by no means a prodigy when it came to math, but she had a fairly creative mind, unlike Henrietta, whose mind greatly resembled Berengar's insofar that it functioned well with mathematics and critical thinking. After the basic instruction was concluded, the girls were split into groups to work on the problems, where Henrietta and Charlotte grouped up together with a third girl who was nearby. The problem was a simple product of multiplication. However, the other girls were struggling with the concept. As such, Henrietta showed the multiplication table Berengar had designed and informed them as to her understanding as to how it worked. 2 times 2 equals 4, because it is the addition of two twos. However, 2 times 3 equals 6, because it is the addition of 3 twos, and so on and so forth. Charlotte, on the other hand, was incredibly frustrated. It was basic mathematics, and yet she was already struggling. One could tell she was not destined to be an engineer or anything which utilized a great deal of math. Instead, she had drawn a picture of a bird, which for her age and lack of proper education was quite acceptable. She of course drew it on the back of her worksheet, which caused Henrietta to lecture the girl. Of course you are not going to understand it if you keep drawing on the back of your worksheets instead of paying attention to the lecture. On the other hand, the other girl in the group perfectly understood Henrietta's explanation and thanked her for the help. "Thank Henrietta, you are always a great help." This caused Henrietta to smile. She never knew it would be so fun to interact with people of her same age. If it was not for Berengar insisting she go to school and interact with the other girls, she probably would have been sheltered alone in the castle her entire life. As such, she responded to the girl's compliment. "It is no problem." Seeing Henrietta and the other girl get along so well, Charlotte began to pout. She was quite a cute girl with a dirty blonde ponytail and mint green eyes. Though compared to Henrietta her appearance was severely lacking. After all, she was dressed in a peasant gown, compared to Henrietta's luxurious noble attire. By the expression on her face, she greatly desired to monopolize Henrietta to herself. Of course, the young girl quickly found a way out of work and began to ask Henrietta questions about her older brother. Henrietta, tell us another tale about Berengar. I heard that he has an eye patch now that looks super cool. The moment Charlotte brought up such a topic, all of the girls in the class began to listen in to Henrietta and the tale she would tell this time. They had completely forgotten about the lesson plan and were attracted by the stories of the dashing young Count of Tyrol. Remembering what her brother had told her, Henrietta decided to tell a story from Berengar's past that was not super embarrassing. Where should I begin? I suppose you could say that Berengar was always sickly growing up, ever since he was a small child, yet despite that he tried not to let his frail nature get in the way of living his life. For example, when I was 5, and he was roughly 15 at the time. Some older kids among the nobility began to bully me. They had stolen my doll and tossed it up into a tree. When Berengar found out about it, he decided to climb the tree and get the doll himself, despite being incredibly weak. He initially fell down from the tree after only managing to climb a few steps. However, he was determined, and as such, despite not having the strength to climb the tree himself, he found a ladder and used it to scale the tree and get my doll back. Afterward, he told me that if I was ever bullied again, to come to get him, and he would give the girls a scolding. Charlotte's eyes began to glitter in excitement when she heard the chivalric actions of Berengar helping his beloved little sister. She could not help but ask the question on her mind. What happened next? Henrietta instantly realized the remainder of the story was not favorable to Berengar's prestigious image, but the entire class was staring at her with curiosity, and as such her resistance immediately collapsed and she revealed the embarrassing details. The girls returned and bullied me again, so I did as my big brother instructed and went to get his help. After he chastised them for their behavior, the older girls, well, they beat him up. The cute and innocent expression on Henrietta's face when she revealed another embarrassing secret of Berengar's made the girls in the class instantly break out in laughter. Even the teacher began to chuckle when she heard about this side of the man often referred to as Berengar the Indomitable by his supporters. To think the man who ruled over the region with supreme authority and dominance was so pitiful in the past was truly an entertaining thought. Henrietta continued her story for a brief bit longer as she addressed the class. After that, I learned that I should not rely on Berengar when I needed to teach someone a lesson. Instead, I went to my other brother Lambert. Though I guess that is no longer the case. The girls were curious about Lambert as most of them had not heard the name before. This sparked curiosity among Henrietta's classmates as they began to daydream about who Lambert was. Surely if he was the stronger of the two brothers, then he would be a renowned warrior. Thus one of the girls quickly asked about Lambert. Who is Lambert? Where is he now? Henrietta's expression sunk. Though her family did not explicitly tell her that Lambert had done something horribly wrong, she was not foolish enough to believe he was innocent. She knew Lambert must have done some unspeakable act to be exiled from her family. She just did not know what exactly had transpired. Thus, a gloomy expression appeared on her face as she went silent. The teacher noticed the sullen expression on the girl's face and immediately tried to redirect the girls' attention so that they would focus on their work and give Henrietta some reprieve. Though she was not aware of Lambert's fate, she knew it could not be something good by the way Henrietta looked when he was mentioned. Come on girls, pay attention, and get your work done. The classroom full of young girls all began to moan in displeasure, but they eventually did what they were told and got back to work. Charlotte whispered to Henrietta while they were going over their worksheets. That was really funny. Your big brother is the best. To which Henrietta blushed in embarrassment. She knew full well that she should not be revealing such info to the girls in her class. However, they all seemed so interested in the story, and as such she could not prevent herself from leaking the information. As such, she felt slightly guilty for her actions, but not enough to prevent her from doing it again. Henrietta quickly buried herself in her work, and it would not be until lunch period where she was vocal about Berengar's embarrassing past once more. Meanwhile, in Berengar's office, the young count felt a sudden itch in his nose, and before he knew it he had sneezed loudly, enough so that if one were nearby they might think it was a blast of thunder. After doing so he rubbed his nose and instantly said his thoughts aloud. Who is talking shit about me? Berengar had no way of knowing that Henrietta had revealed another embarrassing event from his past, for if he did he would surely grab a hold of her puffy little cheeks and pull on them until she was red in the face. However, being unaware of Henrietta's revealing his embarrassing secrets for social clout, he quickly got back to work on approving budgetary concerns.